letter came on a gray Tuesday morning in October of 1908, and it changed everything. Before Eleanor Hartwell had even finished her first cup of tea, she was standing at the kitchen window when she heard the sound of the post being slid through the brass slot in the front door. The cook, Mrs. Briggs, was busy at the stove, and the housemaid, Polly, had gone upstairs to make the beds. So Eleanor set down her cup and walked out of the warm kitchen into the cold hallway herself, her boots clicking softly on the stone floor. The envelope lay on the mat. It was cream-colored, thick, and sealed with dark green wax. The Cavendish crest was pressed into the wax, 2 lions facing each other across a shield. Eleanor picked it up. She turned it over. The handwriting on the front was clean and formal. It was addressed to the Hartwell family of Ashford Manor, Kent. She placed it on the silver tray in the entrance hall and went back to her tea. By the time her mother and sisters came down for breakfast, the envelope had been found, opened, and read aloud 3 times. The Duke of Ashford, Edmund Cavendish, newly returned from 4 years of diplomatic work in Vienna, was holding a grand autumn ball at Cavendish Hall. The date was the 14th of November. All notable families in the county were invited. Dress was formal. The Duke's secretary had signed the letter on his behalf in ink so dark it was almost black. Constance, the eldest Hartwell daughter, read the letter first. She was 26 years old, with dark eyes and a manner of speaking that suggested she had already decided how every conversation would end before it began. She read it once silently, then read it aloud to the room, and when she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it beside her plate as though it now belonged to her personally. "We will need new gowns," she said. Their mother, Catherine Hartwell, pressed one hand to her chest the way she always did when she felt something she could not properly name. She was a thin woman in her early 50s, with gray beginning to appear at her temples and a habit of agreeing with whoever had spoken most recently. She looked at Constance. She looked at the letter. She said, "Yes, yes, we certainly will." Millicent, the second daughter at 23, was already reaching for the letter to read it again herself. She was fairer than Constance, with small blue eyes and the kind of restless energy that expressed itself in the constant rearrangement of things on nearby surfaces. She picked up a teaspoon, put it down in a slightly different position and said, "The Duke is unmarried, isn't he? I read something about it in the newspaper last month." "He is," Constance said. "He is 31. He has the Cavendish estate, the townhouse in London, and the property in Scotland. His father died 2 years ago while Edmund was still abroad. He only took the title formally in the spring." Eleanor, sitting at the far end of the table with a piece of toast she had not yet touched, looked up. "How do you know all of that?" she asked. Constance looked at her the way one looks at a child who has interrupted an adult conversation. "Because I pay attention," she said. "Something you might consider trying." Eleanor looked back down at her toast. She was 20 years old, the youngest of the 3 sisters, and she occupied a particular kind of space in the Hartwell household, present enough to be useful, overlooked enough to be forgotten. She was not considered pretty in the way that Constance and Millicent were considered pretty. She had brown hair, which she wore simply, and brown eyes, and a face that people described later, when pressed, as kind. She was not loud, and she was not bold, and she did not push herself to the front of rooms. She managed the kitchen accounts because no one else wanted to do it. She mended the household linens on Sunday evenings because Mrs. Briggs's eyesight was failing, and Constance and Millicent did not sew. She read in the evenings while her sisters played cards, and she tended the small kitchen garden behind the manor with a steadiness that produced better results every year, though no one particularly mentioned it. She was, in the language of the time, the sister who stayed behind. The days following the arrival of the invitation moved quickly for everyone except Eleanor. Constance arranged for herself and Millicent to be taken to the dressmaker in Maidstone. Mrs. Abbott was a small, serious woman who worked out of a room above a draper's shop and who was trusted by most of the county's better families. Constance chose emerald green silk with jet beading at the neckline. Millicent chose ivory with cream lace trim and a sash at the waist. Both dresses were commissioned immediately, with fittings scheduled twice before the ball. Their mother went along for the appointments and came home each time looking pleasantly flushed, as though she had just been given good news without quite being told what it was. Eleanor was not taken to Maidstone. No one said this directly. No one announced it. It simply was not arranged. The appointments were made, the carriage was ordered, the mornings were spent at the dressmaker, and Eleanor remained at home, managing the household in the way she always did, so that everything ran smoothly in the absence of the other 3 women. She did not say anything about it for over a week. It was Polly, the housemaid, who finally brought it up. She was helping Eleanor carry a basket of dried herbs from the garden shed when she said, without looking up, "Are you not going to the ball, Miss Eleanor?" Eleanor kept walking. I have not been told I am not going. But no dress has been made for you. I am aware of that. Polly said nothing more. She was a practical girl of 17 who had learned early in her time at Hartwell Manor that the household moved in ways it was not wise to question aloud. She helped Eleanor hang the herbs to dry from the kitchen beam and then went back to her other work. That evening, after supper, Eleanor came into the sitting room where her mother and sisters were gathered. Constance was reading. Millicent was working on a piece of embroidery she had started months ago and would likely never finish. Their mother was writing letters to distant relatives. Eleanor stood just inside the doorway. I would like to attend the ball, she said. Constance did not look up from her book. Millicent's needle paused for a moment, then resumed. Their mother looked up, and her expression passed through several stages in the space of 2 seconds. Surprise, then calculation, then something softer that she did not permit herself to hold on to. Of course, Catherine said. Of course you may come. Constance closed her book on one finger, keeping her place. She looked at Eleanor. Then she looked at their mother. Then she appeared to make a decision. There is the blue dress, she said. The one that was Aunt Clara's. That was stored years ago, their mother said. It is still perfectly usable, Constance said. Eleanor is practical. She will not mind. Eleanor said, I do not mind. The conversation ended. There was no offer to commission a new dress. There was no discussion of when Eleanor might visit the dressmaker. There was only the matter-of-fact announcement that there was a dress available, and the equally matter-of-fact acceptance of it. And then Constance opened her book again, and the room returned to its previous quiet. Eleanor went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a long time, looking up at the ceiling. She was not a person who spent much time feeling sorry for herself. She had learned long ago that feeling sorry for yourself accomplished very little and cost a great deal of energy. But she was also honest, and she knew, lying there in the dark, that the thing that had happened in the sitting room was not kindness. It was management. Constance had solved a small problem. The problem of how to acknowledge Eleanor's request without giving anything up. And she had done it cleanly and efficiently, and now it was done. Eleanor thought about the blue dress. She had seen it once, years ago, when it had been briefly taken out of storage for an estate sale they had been considering. It was pale blue satin, which had once been quite fine but had sat in a trunk for nearly 20 years. The hem had frayed. One shoulder seam had come apart and had been repaired by someone at some point in the past with thread of the wrong color. The elbows of the sleeves had worn thin in the way that old satin does, taking on a slightly dulled, almost transparent quality. It was not a dress anyone would choose to wear to a ball hosted by a duke. But Eleanor had said she did not mind, and she had meant it, or at least she had meant that she was not going to make a scene about it, which was close enough to the same thing. She turned onto her side. She thought about the Duke of Ashford, whom she had never met. She tried to form a picture of him but found she could not. She knew only that he was 31, that he had been abroad for 4 years, and that Constance had described him with the particular careful detail she reserved for people she considered important. Constance did not talk about unimportant people that way. She only talked that way about people who mattered to a plan she was forming. Eleanor did not have a plan. She rarely did. She went through her days doing what needed to be done, and she tried to do it well, and she found small things to be glad about. The way the light fell through the kitchen window on winter mornings, the first pale green shoots in the garden each spring, the smell of bread baking, the particular quiet of the house at 10 o'clock at night, when everyone had gone to their rooms and the manor settled into itself. She was not unhappy. She simply was not considered. And there was a difference, she thought, between those two things, though it was sometimes difficult to explain. 2 days before the ball, Constance brought the blue dress from the storage room and laid it across the chaise longue in Eleanor's bedroom. She did not say much. She laid it down, smoothed the skirt with one hand, and said, "There, that should do." Then she left. Eleanor stood alone in the room with the dress for a while. It was worse than she had remembered. The shoulder seam had been repaired with thread that was closer to white than to the pale blue of the satin, and it showed. The hem was not merely frayed, but in several places had come away from the skirt entirely in small triangular separations, like the dress had been trying to take itself apart gradually over the years. The elbows of the sleeves were indeed thin, and in the light from the window Eleanor could see through them slightly. She sat down on the edge of her bed and looked at the dress. She was quiet for a long time. Then she stood up, went to her sewing basket, found her best thread, the closest she had to the original blue of the satin, a slightly grayed blue that was not quite right, but was far better than the white, and she began. She worked until the lamp needed filling. Then she filled it and worked more. She repaired the shoulder seam first, unpicking the old white thread entirely, and stitching it again with small, careful stitches that sat flat and neat. She reattached the sections of the hem that had come away, drawing the fabric back into place with patience, pressing it flat with her thumbnail as she worked. She pressed the entire skirt with the iron, working section by section, letting the satin lie flat under the cloth before she lifted it. She could do nothing about the elbows. The satin was simply too thin there, and any attempt to stitch it would have made it worse. She accepted that. She worked through the next evening as well, after supper, in her room, with the door closed. She pressed the skirt a second time. She found a small brooch that had belonged to her mother, a pale silver cluster of leaves, delicate and old, and she pinned it near the repaired shoulder seam, precisely at the point where the new stitching met the original. It drew the eye to the brooch and away from the repair, and it was also simply beautiful, the way old silver work is beautiful. On the morning of the ball, she washed her hair and rinsed it with a few sprigs of dried rosemary from the kitchen, the way her grandmother had shown her when she was a child. It dried soft and with a faint, pleasant scent. She dressed it herself, pinning it up in a simple style, nothing elaborate, just clean and neat and smooth. She put on the blue dress. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room and looked at herself for a moment. The dress was not magnificent. The repairs were good, but the dress was old, and it looked old. The satin had the particular quality of fabric that has been stored for many years. There was a very slight rigidity to it, a memory of having been folded, that even the best pressing had not entirely removed. The elbows were still thin, the color was still a little faded, but the brooch caught the light, and the skirt fell cleanly, and her hair was smooth, and her face, though she did not think of it this way, was entirely calm. She picked up her gloves. She went downstairs. Constance and Millicent were in the entrance hall when she arrived. Constance, in her emerald silk, with jet beads catching the lamplight, looked precisely as she had planned to look, which was impressive. Millicent, in her ivory and cream lace, looked pretty in a soft, careful way. Their mother was adjusting Millicent's sash. Constance looked at Eleanor when she came down the stairs. Something moved across Constance's face for a very brief moment. It was not quite guilt, and it was not quite surprise. It was perhaps the recognition that Eleanor had done more with the dress than Constance had expected. Whatever it was gone so fast that Eleanor was not entirely sure she had seen it. "You are ready," Constance said. "Yes," Eleanor said. Their mother looked at her. Her expression was harder to read. She looked at Eleanor for 2 full seconds, longer than she usually looked at Eleanor for anything, and then she said, "The carriage is waiting." They went out into the dark October night, and the horses moved forward through the lanes of Kent, and the lights of Cavendish Hall were already visible from a mile away, golden and plentiful, scattered across the darkness like something burning steadily inside a great stone box. Eleanor looked at them through the carriage window. She pressed her hands together in her lap, not from nerves exactly, but from something she could not quite identify, not hope. She was not in the habit of hoping for things that had not shown any sign of being possible, not dread either, something quieter than both. She watched the lights grow larger as the carriage moved closer. She did not know what was going to happen that night. She did not know that a man she had never met was at that moment standing at the edge of a crowded ballroom, speaking with his private secretary, and was about to stop speaking and look across the room for a reason he himself could not have explained. A flicker of motion, a quality of stillness among the general movement of 200 people dressed in their finest, and see a young woman in a worn blue dress sitting quietly beside an elderly widow, listening with the full, genuine attention that most people reserve for things that actually matter to them. She did not know any of that. She only knew that the carriage was moving forward, and the lights of Cavendish Hall were very bright against the dark country sky, and the night was cold and clear and felt, in some way she could not name, like the beginning of something. Cavendish Hall stood at the end of a long gravel drive flanked by oak trees, and when the carriage turned through the iron gates, Eleanor felt the sounds change. The clatter of the horses on the lane gave way to something softer, and the golden light pouring from every window of the great house seemed almost warm from this far away, though the night air outside the carriage was cold enough to make the breath visible. The carriage joined a short queue of others moving toward the entrance. Eleanor could see figures descending from the vehicles ahead, dark coats, silk skirts catching the torchlight at the door, white gloves bright in the darkness. The footmen at the steps were wearing the Cavendish livery, a deep navy with silver buttons, and they moved quickly and professionally, opening doors and handing down passengers without appearing to hurry. Millicent was craning her neck to see better through the window. "There must be 200 people tonight," she said. She was not complaining. She was noting it the way a person notes something in their favor. "More perhaps," Constance said. She was sitting very straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap, looking ahead with the particular expression she wore when she was concentrating on projecting composure. The county families have all been invited, and the Duke will have his own connections from London and from his time abroad. Their mother said, "I hope the music is good." The last county ball had dreadful music. The violinist was simply too slow. No one responded to this. Their carriage reached the steps. A footman opened the door. Constance descended first, then Millicent, then their mother. Eleanor came last, and when the footman offered his hand to help her down, she took it briefly and stepped onto the gravel. The air smelled of wood smoke and frost and something floral that was drifting out from the open doors of the hall. Hothouse roses, perhaps, or something more deliberate, something the housekeeper had arranged specifically for this evening. They went up the steps. Inside the entrance hall, which was larger than the entire ground floor of Hartwell Manor, the noise was immediate. Not loud, exactly. This was too formal a gathering for loudness, but full. The sound of 200 people in conversation, of a small orchestra playing from somewhere to the left, of boot heels on stone floors and the soft swish of silk skirts, and beneath all of it, a steady undertone of people assessing each other, which requires no particular sound of its own but is still somehow audible. A butler took their wraps. Constance had already located the nearest mirror to check her appearance, and Millicent was doing the same at a slight distance, so as not to appear to be doing the same thing. Their mother was looking around the entrance hall with an expression of polite wonder that was entirely genuine. She had not been inside Cavendish Hall since before her husband had died, which was now 10 years ago, and it looked different to her with the renovations that had been made during the old Duke's final years. Eleanor stood just inside the doorway for a moment and let the room settle around her. The entrance hall opened through a wide arch into the ballroom beyond, and from where she stood she could see the chandeliers. 4 of them, immense, hung with hundreds of glass drops that caught every candle flame and scattered it in small bright points across the ceiling and the upper walls. The floor of the ballroom was pale wood, polished until it reflected the dancers upon it. The walls were cream and gold with large windows that had been dressed in heavy curtains of deep burgundy, all of which were closed against the October night. Long tables along the far wall held food and drink, attended by more staff in Cavendish navy and silver. It was beautiful. Eleanor would have been dishonest with herself to claim otherwise, but it was also very full of people who had dressed very carefully, and the first thing she noticed as they moved from the entrance hall into the ballroom itself was that she was, in an objective sense, far less well-dressed than almost anyone else in the room. This was not self-pity. It was simply observation. The other women present were wearing gowns that had been made this season, or at most last season, in fabrics that had not spent 20 years in a storage trunk. Even the older women, the ones who were past the age of caring greatly about fashion, were wearing gowns that sat correctly, that had not faded, that fit as clothes fit when they have been made for the person wearing them. Eleanor noted this. She did not dwell on it. Constance had already begun to move with the particular directed drift she used in social situations, which looked like casual wandering but was in fact entirely purposeful. She was making her way toward the area of the room where the Duke was most likely to be found, which she would have assessed the moment she entered the ballroom. She was excellent at this. Eleanor watched her for a moment, the way she angled toward certain groups and away from others, the way she managed to make eye contact with the right people and somehow not quite see the ones it did not benefit her to see. It was, Eleanor thought, a genuine skill. She did not have it herself, and she did not particularly wish she did, but she could recognize it as a skill the way you can recognize skill in a thing you would not choose to do yourself. Millicent had found a group of young women she knew from a neighboring family, and had joined them easily, immediately laughing at something one of them had said. Millicent was good at that too, at arriving in a group and making herself seem as though she had been there slightly longer than she had. Their mother had been collected by Mrs. Pemberton, an old acquaintance from her own younger years, and was already in deep conversation near one of the windows. Eleanor was, in the space of perhaps 5 minutes from their arrival, entirely alone. She stood for a moment with a glass of lemonade she had taken from a passing tray, and she looked around the room with honest curiosity, because she had never been inside Cavendish Hall before, and she was genuinely interested in what she saw. The plasterwork on the ceiling was extraordinary. There were painted panels between the molded frames, depicting classical scenes in soft greens and blues and golds, each about the size of a large painting. The floor, up close, had a narrow inlaid border of darker wood running along its edge, which she had not noticed from the doorway. Near the orchestra, which was playing a gentle waltz from a slightly raised platform, she could see the music stands were engraved with the Cavendish crest. She walked slowly along the edge of the room, not aimlessly but not with any particular destination, and she was looking at the large portrait that hung to the left of the fireplace, a previous Cavendish Duke in military dress. 18th century by the style of it, looking out of the canvas with an expression of mild skepticism, when a voice beside her said, "I hope you are not expecting him to blink. He has not done so in approximately 140 years. Eleanor turned. The woman who had spoken was perhaps 70, small and somewhat bent, with white hair dressed very simply, and a gown of dark gray that was clearly expensive and clearly old. She had the look of a person who had once cared a great deal about many things, and had arrived at an age where she had been selective. She was looking at Eleanor with eyes that were very sharp and somewhat amused. "I was not expecting him to blink," Eleanor said. "I was looking at the background. The painter has put a window on the wrong side of the room." The woman turned her head to look at the portrait. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are absolutely right. I have walked past that painting 40 times and never noticed." She seemed genuinely pleased about this. "I am Agnes Fentham. I am here because my late husband and the previous Duke were at school together, which means I receive an invitation to everything Cavendish regardless of my own relevance, which I find very convenient." "I am Eleanor Hartwell," Eleanor said. "I am here because my sister Constance wished to attend, and it would have been ungracious to leave me at home." Agnes Fentham's mouth curved slightly. "Refreshing honesty," she said. "Shall we find somewhere to sit? My knees are not what they were." They found 2 chairs against the wall, not far from the end of the long table with the food, which Mrs. Fentham noted approvingly. "Always sit near the food," she said, with some authority. "People bring you things." Eleanor sat beside her, and found that Agnes Fentham was one of those people who have grown old, without losing their capacity for genuine interest in the world. She asked questions and listened to the answers with real attention. She had a dry, quiet humor that came out in small, well-placed observations, and she did not seem to find it necessary to say anything that was not worth saying. They talked about the county. They talked about the portraits on the walls. Mrs. Fentham had a story about 2 of them. They talked about the garden at Cavendish Hall, which Mrs. Fentham had once been shown in its summer glory, and which she described in enough detail that Eleanor could almost picture it. And then, naturally, they talked about gardens in general, and Eleanor mentioned the kitchen garden at Hartwell Manor, and Mrs. Fentham mentioned that she grew Himalayan poppies in her own garden in Sevenoaks. "I did not think they would survive the clay soil," Eleanor said. "Kent clay is very heavy." "It is," Mrs. Fentham agreed. "I was told they would not take. I grew them anyway. They are very beautiful in early autumn, just before the cold sets in. A very particular color, not quite purple, not quite blue. Something in between, like the sky at a specific moment that only lasts a few minutes." Eleanor thought about this. How long did it take them to establish? 3 years before they were reliable. The first year they barely survived. The second year they were indifferent. The third year I had more than I knew what to do with. Mrs. Fentham turned to look at Eleanor with an expression of mild instruction. "Most things worth growing take that long." Eleanor smiled. From her position near the wall, she had been watching the room as she and Mrs. Fentham talked, not with the deliberate survey that Constance applied to a room, but with the ordinary peripheral awareness of someone sitting in a public space. She had seen Constance maneuver successfully to a group that included 2 men she did not recognize, both of whom were dressed in the particular way of men who did not need to think about how they dressed. She had seen Millicent dancing a first dance with a young man with red hair who looked very pleased with himself. She had seen her mother laughing at something Mrs. Pemberton had said. She had also seen, at various points, a man she assumed was the Duke. He was not impossible to identify. He was the person that other people angled toward without appearing to angle, the way iron filings move toward a magnet while pretending to simply be lying there. He was tall, with light brown hair, and a way of standing that suggested he was comfortable in formal clothes, without being vain about them. He moved through the room with a private secretary at his shoulder, a younger man with spectacles and a very serious expression, and he greeted people with what appeared to be genuine attention, though Eleanor noticed, from her distant vantage point, that his genuine attention was somewhat more genuine for some people than for others. He paused longer in some conversations. He looked at certain people while they were speaking rather than looking slightly to the side, which is what people do when they are waiting for their turn to talk. When he actually looked at you, Eleanor thought, it probably felt quite different from the rest of the room. She was not looking at him with any particular design. She was simply noticing what was there to be noticed, because that was what she did. Mrs. Fentham was describing the specific method she used to prepare the soil for the poppies. She had discovered that mixing in a particular quantity of grit, purchased from a builder's supplier rather than a garden merchant, made a significant difference, and Eleanor was genuinely listening, because it was genuinely interesting, and because it might be applicable to the section of her own garden she had been meaning to improve. She did not notice, and had no reason to think she should, that she had been looked at from across the room. She did not know that a man she had only just identified by his position in a room, not by his title, not by his property, not by the considerable weight of what he represented to most of the women present that evening, had paused his own conversation to look in her direction for a second time. She did not know that his private secretary, a man named Arthur Brent, had followed his employer's gaze, and then looked back at the Duke with the careful expression of a person who does not show what he is thinking, and had long ago decided that this policy served him well. She did not know any of this. She was listening to an old woman describe clay soil and grit and the patience required for beautiful things to establish themselves, and she was paying attention, and the glass of lemonade in her hand had gone slightly warm, and the orchestra had moved from the waltz to a livelier piece that was pulling more couples onto the floor. Outside the tall windows, the October night was fully dark, and inside the great chandeliers were burning steadily, and Eleanor Hartwell, in her worn blue dress with the silver brooch at the shoulder, sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and was, without knowing it, the most genuinely present person in the room. Which is perhaps why she was the one who was seen. The orchestra finished the lively piece and paused. There was a brief scattering of applause from the couples on the floor, and then the musicians conferred quietly among themselves and began the introduction to a waltz. It was a slower piece, more deliberate, the kind of music that requires a particular kind of commitment from a partner because there is nowhere to hide in it. Eleanor watched the floor. Constance had found her way to a better position and was now, Eleanor could see, in conversation with the same man she had been angling toward all evening. He was speaking, and Constance was listening with her head tilted slightly to the right, which was the posture she used when she wanted to appear to be giving her undivided attention while in fact deciding what to say next. Mrs. Fentham had moved on from the subject of soil preparation and was now describing, with great affection, a dog she had owned 20 years ago, a terrier named Bernard, who had an inexplicable hatred of postmen and an equally inexplicable fondness for members of the clergy. He would go absolutely still the moment a vicar entered a room, she said, not friendly, not aggressive, just still, as though the presence of the clergy reminded him of something important. Perhaps it did, Eleanor said. Perhaps it did, Mrs. Fentham agreed, looking at her with approval. Eleanor had not been watching the Duke's movements. She had truly not been tracking him across the room the way Constance was tracking him, the way half the room was tracking him in their various subtle and not-so-subtle ways. She had noted where he was earlier in the way that you note the location of anything significant in a room you are sharing with it, and she had returned to her conversation, and she had not thought about him again. So when a pair of evening shoes stopped in front of her chair, dark shoes, very well made, the kind that do not draw attention to themselves, she looked up without any particular preparation for what she would see. Edmund Cavendish was standing in front of her. He was taller than she had estimated from across the room. He had the kind of face that does not settle into any single expression but holds several at once, something alert in it, and something patient, and at this exact moment something that might have been amusement, though quiet, the kind that does not announce itself. Arthur Brent stood slightly behind him and to the left, looking past Eleanor at the wall with professional neutrality. Mrs. Fentham had gone entirely still beside Eleanor, which was remarkable, because she had been mid-sentence about Bernard the Terrier. The Duke of Ashford said, "Miss Hartwell, I believe you are the youngest daughter of the Hartwell family of Ashford?" Eleanor said, "I am." He said, "The next dance is a waltz. Would you do me the honor?" Eleanor looked at him. She was not, at this moment, thinking about her dress, or about her sisters, or about what anyone in the room was going to think. She was simply looking at the man in front of her, who had asked her a direct question, and who was waiting for a direct answer, with the unhurried patience of someone who genuinely could not predict what the answer would be. She stood up. "Yes," she said, "thank you." He offered his arm. She took it, and they walked out onto the floor together, and the waltz began. The waltz was in three-quarter time, and the orchestra played it at a pace that was neither rushed nor lazy, steady and clear, each beat distinct enough to hold on to. Eleanor had not danced in over 2 years, not since a neighbor's wedding in the summer of 1906, but her body remembered the steps the way it remembered things it had learned properly once, a steadiness below the level of conscious thought. Edmund was a good dancer. This was evident from the first measure. He did not grip her hand too firmly, and he did not lead in the clumsy, overconfident way that men sometimes lead when they are more interested in demonstrating that they are leading than in actually guiding their partner. He was simply steady and responsive, and moved with a natural ease that suggested the skill had been acquired long ago and then forgotten about, the way useful things are forgotten about once they become part of how a person moves through the world. Eleanor kept her eyes level, not looking over his shoulder as some women did, not looking at his face with the fixed attentiveness that others sometimes used as a strategy. She was simply present in the dance, aware of the music and the floor, and the warmth of the room and the blue dress moving around her legs. He spoke first. "You were speaking with Mrs. Fentham." "I was," Eleanor said. "She is an old friend of this house. She comes to everything here, always has. She was very close to my father in his later years." He paused for a half-beat. "What were you discussing so attentively?" Eleanor considered whether to give a brief, social answer, something pleasant and vague that would move the conversation along without committing to anything, and decided against it. "She grows Himalayan poppies," Eleanor said. "In clay soil." "I was asking her how she managed it." He looked at her, not in the way of someone assessing what kind of impression she was trying to make, but in the way of someone who has been given an answer they did not expect and is actually considering it. "In Sevenoaks?" he said. "I would not have thought that soil would take them. She mixes in builder's grit, not from a garden merchant. She says the builder's grit has a different consistency." "Does it work?" "She says it took 3 years before the plants were reliable. The first 2 were difficult." "That is interesting," he said, and he seemed to mean it, which Eleanor noted. They turned at the corner of the floor. From this angle, Eleanor could see the edges of the room, the people seated along the walls, the couples on the floor, the staff moving quietly near the tables. She could not see her sisters from where she was, which was perhaps a mercy. "Do you garden yourself?" he asked. "Yes, mostly food, the kitchen garden at our home." "Vegetables?" "Yes. And herbs. I have a section for cut flowers that I let go mostly wild, cornflowers and sweet peas and love in a mist. They come back on their own each year, more or less." "More or less?" "Sometimes they are very reliable. Sometimes there is a cold spring and half of them fail, and I plant more, and by midsummer it is impossible to tell there was ever a problem." He smiled at this, not politely, not socially, but as though the information had actually produced a reaction in him, rather than the other way around. "You are from Ashford itself?" he said. "Yes, Hartwell Manor. It is about 3 miles from the town, just off the Y road." "I know it," he said. "There is a large chestnut tree at the gate. 2, actually, 1 on each side. They were planted by my grandfather." He was quiet for a moment, turning her again, and she moved with him easily. Around them, other couples danced their own private conversations, or their silences, and the orchestra played on, and the chandeliers above scattered their light across the floor. "How long have you been at Ashford?" Eleanor asked. "Since April," he said. "Before that, Vienna for 4 years. And before Vienna, a year in Paris. And before that, 2 years in various places that I will not list because it would take until the end of the waltz." "Vienna must have been remarkable." "It was very beautiful," he said, without quite agreeing that it had been remarkable. "And very busy. And very full of people who wanted things from each other." "As opposed to Kent," Eleanor said. He looked at her again. "As opposed to Kent, yes, though I will say that the wanting in Kent is sometimes more honest. In Vienna it was dressed up considerably." "What sort of things did they want?" "Information mostly, influence, positions and favors, and to know what was being decided before it was announced." He paused. "The work I was doing was diplomatic, which means it was essentially a long, careful conversation that lasted 4 years, and at the end of it everyone shook hands and went home, and 3 months later everything was more or less as it had been." Eleanor said, "That sounds exhausting." "It was exhausting," he said simply. "I was glad to come home." There was a brief silence between them that did not feel like the absence of something. The music moved through them both. "Have you ever left Kent?" he asked. Eleanor said, "No. Have you wished to?" She was quiet for a moment, because it was a question that required an honest answer, and the honest answer was not simple. She thought about it, genuinely, there on the floor with the waltz moving around them. "Sometimes," she said at last, "but I think what I wish for, when I think about it carefully, is not so much to leave as to see. There is a difference. I do not have any particular desire to go and never return, but I would like to have seen the poppies growing in the Alps, for instance, or the light on the Seine that people are always writing about, or the olive trees in the south of France, which I have read about in at least 3 different books and which all 3 describe differently." He was watching her as she spoke. "What books?" he asked. She told him, She named the 3 books, one of which was a travel account, and one of which was a novel, and one of which was a collection of letters written by a woman who had lived in Provence for a year, and written home to her sister about everything she ate. He had read one of them. He had not read the other 2. He asked whether the letters were worth reading. Yes, Eleanor said. She describes the food with enormous care. You will never think about an olive the same way. He laughed. It was a real laugh, not a social one, not a measured one. A laugh that came out before it could be checked, which was evident in the slight surprise on his face in the half-second after it. Several couples near them glanced over. I will find it, he said. It is not widely known, Eleanor said. I found my copy at a book sale in Maidstone 2 years ago. I have contacts in the book trade, he said, with what she now recognized as the dry, quiet humor she had not initially been certain was there. I believe I can manage. The waltz was nearing its end. Eleanor could hear it in the way the orchestra was gathering itself toward the final measures, that particular drawing together that happens in the last minute of a piece of music. She said, You said you were glad to come home. Is it what you expected, coming back after 4 years? He considered this. Some of it. The house is what I remembered, more or less. The county is what I remembered. The people are what I remembered mostly. He paused. But I am different from what I was when I left, so it does not feel quite the same as remembering. It feels more like meeting something again for the first time. Eleanor thought about this. I think that is probably what all returning is, she said. He looked at her, and there was that thing again in his expression, the genuine attention, the sense of someone actually registering what they had heard, rather than filing it away to acknowledge later. Yes, he said, I think it is. The final measures came. The music resolved. He stepped back slightly and released her hand. Eleanor lowered her own hand and stood for a moment in the resumed noise of the ballroom, which had felt muted during the dance and now came back to full volume like a room whose shutters have been opened. He bowed, briefly, correctly. She dipped her head. Around them, the other couples were separating too, and there was the particular rustle of a ballroom floor clearing, and the sound of conversation starting back up again on all sides. Miss Hartwell, he said, thank you for the dance. Thank you, Your Grace, she said. He looked at her for one more moment with that same quality of attention. Then Arthur Brent appeared at his shoulder with the quiet, inevitable presence of a man whose job is to materialize at exactly the right moment, and Edmund Cavendish turned and was absorbed back into the room, and Eleanor walked back toward the edge of the floor. She was barely 10 steps from the center of the ballroom before she understood that something had happened. She could feel it in the room, not in any dramatic way, no gasps, no open staring, nothing that would be easy to point to afterward. But a social room has a texture, and the texture of this one had shifted slightly. The attention that had been generally distributed had reorganized itself, and some portion of it was now oriented in her direction, which was not where it had been before. She walked to her chair. Mrs. Fentham was sitting exactly as she had been, with her hands folded in her lap and her expression composed, but her eyes, when Eleanor sat down, were rather more alert than they had been. Well, Mrs. Fentham said after a moment. Well, Eleanor agreed. There was a brief silence. He is a good dancer, Mrs. Fentham said. Yes, Eleanor said. He is. So are you, for what it is worth. Eleanor looked at her. Mrs. Fentham was looking straight ahead at the floor where the next set was beginning to form, her expression offering nothing in particular. I have not danced in 2 years, Eleanor said. That is not something one could have told, Mrs. Fentham said simply. Eleanor looked down at her hands in her lap. The silver brooch at her shoulder caught the light from the nearest chandelier and threw a small bright point onto the wall beside her for a moment before she shifted and it disappeared. She was very aware, now, of something she had managed largely not to be aware of during the dance itself. The dress, the worn satin, the repaired seam beneath the brooch, the thin elbows. She had not thought about any of it while she was dancing, which she recognized as a kind of grace, whether her own or the dance's she could not have said. But now she was sitting again at the edge of the room, and the awareness had returned, and with it, certain thoughts. Constance had seen her dance with the Duke, she was sure of it. Constance saw everything in a room she had decided to watch, and she had certainly been watching the floor during the waltz. Eleanor did not look for her sisters. She did not look for her mother. She kept her eyes forward, and she breathed carefully, and she thought about the olive trees in the south of France, described differently in 3 different books, which was perhaps because the trees themselves were different each time you looked at them, depending on the light and the hour and who you were when you were looking. From across the room, she heard Millicent laugh, her particular high, bright laugh that carried. She heard the general music of the room settle back into itself, and she sat there, in her worn blue dress, beside a small and sharp old woman who grew poppies in clay soil against all advice, and she felt something she did not quite have a name for. Not triumph, not at all. She had never wanted the sort of thing that triumph would have meant. Not relief exactly, though there was something adjacent to it. It was something quieter than both. Something that had to do with having been seen, genuinely seen, not in the way that her family looked at her, a fixture in the house, a useful part of the machinery, the one who made sure the linen was mended and the accounts were correct and the garden produced what it was supposed to produce, but seen by a stranger who had no reason to look and every reason to look elsewhere, and who had looked anyway. It was a small thing. It was also not small at all. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the next dance begin, and she was careful about her own thoughts, the way she was careful about most things, not suppressing them exactly, but not letting them run ahead of what was actually known. What was known was this: a man had asked her to dance. She had danced. He had been kind and attentive and interesting to speak with. That was all that was known, and she was not going to construct anything larger from it tonight. The waltz had been real. The conversation had been real. The rest was still unwritten, and she was, in her most private self, wary of unwritten things, because she had learned that they could be taken back by the morning. But the dance had happened. That, at least, was something she could hold. The orchestra began a new piece, something bright and quick, and couples moved onto the floor again, and the room filled with the particular energy of a ball that has found its rhythm and is now carrying itself forward on its own momentum. Footmen circulated with drinks. Laughter rose and fell in waves. Near the fireplace at the far end of the room, a group of older men were in deep conversation about something that had nothing to do with dancing, and one of them was gesturing with his glass in a way that suggested considerable feeling. Mrs. Fentham, who had been sitting with the composed patience of someone who has been to many events in her long life, and no longer needs them to provide anything in particular, turned to Eleanor and said, "Tell me about your kitchen garden." Eleanor turned and looked at her. "All of it?" she said. "Whatever you think is worth telling," Mrs. Fentham said. So Eleanor told her about the kitchen garden at Hartwell Manor, about the raised beds she had built 3 summers ago from old timber, and filled with better soil than the clay below provided, about the rotation she used to keep the ground productive, about the wall at the southern end that held heat and let her grow things that would not otherwise survive the Kent winters, about the first time she had managed to bring in a good crop of French beans, which had required 2 failed attempts to teach her what they needed. She told it simply and without embellishment, because the facts of it were interesting enough on their own, and Mrs. Fentham listened with genuine attention, asking questions that showed she was actually following what Eleanor said. It was, Eleanor thought, a very fine way to spend an evening. Not the way she might once have imagined spending an evening at a duke's ball, perhaps, but a very fine way all the same. At some point, she became aware that her mother had appeared nearby and was standing in conversation with a woman Eleanor did not know, and that her mother's eyes had moved to Eleanor once, briefly, with an expression that Eleanor could not read at that distance, and that her mother covered quickly by turning back to her companion. Constance, Eleanor saw at last, was on the far side of the room, with the same group she had joined earlier. She was talking with great animation, and did not appear to be looking in Eleanor's direction, which was itself a kind of looking in Eleanor's direction. Millicent had been claimed by the red-haired young man for a second dance. She looked happy about it. The evening moved on. Eleanor danced once more, with an older gentleman named Colonel Hartley, who danced with the energetic imprecision of a man who had always enjoyed dancing more than he had ever been good at it, and who told her 3 very good stories about a horse he had owned in his 20s. She brought Mrs. Fentham a small plate of food from the long table, because she was going that way anyway, and the old woman's knees were clearly a genuine problem. She spoke briefly with a woman who turned out to be the wife of one of the Cavendish estate managers, who had a great deal to say about the walled garden at the Hall, and who mentioned, in passing, that the head gardener had been trying to establish Himalayan poppies in the eastern bed for 4 seasons now without much success. Eleanor mentioned the builder's grit. The woman wrote it down. Later in the evening, as the ball began its gradual, reluctant shift toward conclusion, the music becoming slightly slower, the food tables thinning, some of the older guests beginning the prolonged business of finding their coats and their carriages, Eleanor found herself standing near the entrance to the hallway, waiting while her mother sent Polly, who had come for the purpose, to fetch their wraps. She was standing there, looking at the entrance hall and the great dark staircase that went up from it, lit at the top by a lamp she could only partially see, when she heard Edmund Cavendish's voice from somewhere behind her. She did not turn around. She could hear him finishing a conversation with someone, something brief, something that ended with the other person laughing and saying good night. She heard his footsteps. And then he was beside her, not quite standing in her path but close enough that it was clear he had moved in her direction. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "I am glad to have met you tonight," he said. He said it directly and without decoration, the way he seemed to say most things. Eleanor said, "I am glad to have been here." A small silence. "I hope you will forgive me," he said. "I would like to remember the name of those letters you mentioned, the woman who wrote from Provence." She told him the title and the author's name. He repeated them quietly, as though committing them to memory. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. He looked at her for a moment with that same quality of attention, steady and present, and without performance of any kind. Then Constance appeared at Eleanor's elbow, very smoothly, from a direction Eleanor had not been tracking, and said, "Your Grace, I hope you will forgive my sister. She has always loved to monopolize good conversation," with a small, warm laugh that meant the opposite of what it said. Edmund Cavendish looked at Constance briefly. He said, "On the contrary, I am the one who should ask forgiveness for keeping Miss Hartwell from her family." He turned back to Eleanor. "Good night, Miss Hartwell. Safe journey home." "Good night," Eleanor said. He moved away. Constance was very still beside her, for exactly 1 second before she moved too, in a different direction, and her face, from the side, told Eleanor nothing at all. Their wraps came. Their mother gathered them. They went down the steps into the cold October night, and the carriage was waiting, and the horses moved forward through the dark, and Cavendish Hall fell away behind them. Eleanor watched it go through the back window, the lights still burning, the sound of the music still faint and then gone, and the country road dark and quiet on all sides. She turned back to face forward. Millicent was already asleep on their mother's shoulder. Constance was looking out her window, and her face in the dark glass of the window was difficult to read, and Eleanor decided, tonight, not to try. The carriage ride home from Cavendish Hall lasted just over an hour, and in that hour not much was said. Millicent, who had declared herself awake again by the time they turned out of the Cavendish Drive, was in a cheerful mood that had nothing to do with Eleanor, and everything to do with the red-haired young man, whose name she revealed was Philip Croft, son of the Croft family from near Tonbridge, and who had asked if he might write to her. Millicent spoke about Philip Croft for perhaps 20 minutes, and their mother said the appropriate things in the appropriate places, and Constance listened without appearing to listen, which was different from not listening. Eleanor said nothing about Philip Croft. He sounded pleasant enough, and Millicent's happiness was entirely genuine, and Eleanor saw no reason to add or subtract from it. Constance did not say anything about the Duke. She did not say anything about the dance. She did not say anything about the moment at the end of the evening, which Eleanor suspected had been logged and filed with great precision, and would be considered in private, at a time and in a way that Constance chose. When they arrived home, Polly had left a lamp burning in the entrance hall, and a pot of tea on the kitchen stove, staying warm on the low heat. They removed their wraps in the hall, and their mother went directly to bed, and Millicent paused only long enough to take a cup of tea before she too went up, still talking about Philip Croft to herself, in a quiet, derwerpized murmur on the stairs. Constance and Eleanor were left alone in the kitchen. Constance poured herself tea. She poured Eleanor a cup too, without asking, and set it on the table. She sat down. Eleanor sat down across from her. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the stove, and outside the window the October night was very dark and very still. Constance held her cup with both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "He asked you to dance first." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Before anyone else?" "Yes." Constance was quiet for a moment. She was not, Eleanor could see, in the mood for pretense, which was unusual. Constance almost always preferred to manage conversations through some level of performance, even in private. The absence of it now was notable. "He spoke to you at the end of the evening as well," Constance said. "Briefly, yes." "What did you talk about?" Eleanor considered this. "Books," she said. "A book I mentioned during the dance. He wanted to remember the title." Constance looked at her then, finally, directly. Her expression was not angry. It was something closer to the face of a person solving a problem they had not expected to encounter in this particular form. "You know what that means," Constance said. "A man mentioning a book? A man of his position going out of his way, at the end of an evening, when there are 100 things to see to, and 100 people wanting a last word, to find a woman he has already spoken to and ask about a book." Constance set down her cup. "It is not about the book." Eleanor said nothing. "You must know that," Constance said. Eleanor said, I try not to construct things that are not yet built. Constance looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something Eleanor had not expected. She said, "That is probably wise." She said it without bitterness and without irony. She said it as though she had considered the sentence and meant what it said. Eleanor looked at her sister. Constance looked back at her tea. After a moment, Constance said, "The dress looked better than I thought it would." Eleanor said, "I repaired it." "I know you repaired it," Constance said. "I could see that you had." There was a silence that was not comfortable, but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who know each other too well to pretend, but not well enough to say everything. "Go to bed, Eleanor," Constance said, not unkindly. Eleanor went. She lay in bed with the lamp off and the window showing her the very dark sky, and she thought about what Constance had said. She thought about the part where Constance said it was not about the book. She thought about the part where Constance said it was probably wise not to construct things that were not yet built. She thought about the dance. She thought about the way he had laughed, the genuine surprise of it, before he could adjust it into something more composed. She thought about the way he had asked questions and then listened to the answers. She thought about the thing he had said about Vienna, about how the wanting there had been dressed up considerably, as opposed to Kent where it was sometimes more honest. She wondered what honest wanting looked like to him. She wondered what it looked like to her. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes and told herself, firmly, to sleep. Sleep came eventually. It always did. The morning after the ball was gray and damp, and the manor settled back into its ordinary rhythms with a speed that Eleanor found both sensible and faintly melancholy. Mrs. Briggs made a large breakfast, which the family needed after staying so late, and the conversation over the table was quiet and domestic, and had nothing to do with the Duke of Ashford. Millicent went out after breakfast to return a borrowed shawl to a friend in the village, and was gone most of the morning. Their mother spent the morning writing letters, thank you notes for recent invitations, replies to correspondence that had been waiting, a long letter to a cousin in Bath. Constance was in the sitting room with an account book she had been meaning to review for 2 weeks, and she was reviewing it now with the concentrated attention she brought to things she had decided to do today. Eleanor went to the garden. The kitchen garden in November had a particular quality that she had come to appreciate over the years. The beds were mostly emptied and turned, the soil dark and resting, the structure of the thing more visible when it was not covered in growing things. You could see what you had built and how it worked and what you might change, which was not possible in summer when it was all abundance and noise. She pulled on her heavy coat and her gardening gloves and she went out through the back door, her boots immediately damp from the grass. The sky was low and pale gray, the kind of sky that promises cold without necessarily delivering rain, and the air smelled of turned soil and the particular clean coldness of late autumn. She walked the bed slowly, checking what was still in the ground, a late planting of winter spinach that was surviving, a row of leeks that would be good through January, some parsnips that she had left in the ground because parsnips sweeten with frost. She pulled one parsnip up, turned it in her hand, pressed it with her thumb to test the flesh, and put it back. She was at the far end of the garden, near the old stone wall, when she became aware that she was not thinking about the garden at all. She was thinking about Edmund Cavendish. She stood still for a moment and allowed herself to be honest about this, because she had found over the years that being dishonest with yourself about what you were thinking was more trouble than it was worth. She was thinking about him. She had been thinking about him, in the background of everything, since she woke up that morning, not in any complicated or dramatic way, simply in the way you think about a thing that has happened, the way you return to it and look at it from different angles, the way you let it become familiar before you decide what to feel about it. She had liked him. This was not a decision she had made. It was simply something she noticed about herself, the way you notice the weather or the state of the garden, as information about what was real. He was interesting. He was honest, or seemed to be. He asked questions and listened. He laughed at things that were actually worth laughing at, and did not laugh at things that were not, which was rarer than it should have been. He spoke about his work in Vienna without false modesty and without boasting, just described it as what it was, which was exhausting and not very productive, and said he was glad to be home. He was, she thought, a person she would have liked regardless of anything else about him. The regardless of anything else being, of course, rather significant, but the fact that he was the Duke of Ashford, with the estate and the properties and the title, and all of the weight that came with those things, was not a small regardless. It was a large and complicated regardless. It was the kind of regardless that could change the shape of a life, if it went in any particular direction. Eleanor stood at the far end of the kitchen garden, near the stone wall that held the heat in summer and stood cold and damp now in November. and she looked at the turned earth of the beds and the dark sky above them, and she thought about what Constance had said. It was probably wise not to construct things that were not yet built. She thought about what she herself had said in the dance. I try not to construct things that are not yet built. She thought that this was true, and that it was a reasonable way to be, and that it had served her well most of the time. She also thought that it was very easy to say you did not construct things when there was nothing in particular to build from, and that now there was something, or might be something, or might become something, some small material, some foundation, something that might be built upon or might simply sit there in the ground, like a seed that the frost would take. She did not know which it was. She turned back toward the house. Inside, the warmth hit her, and she stamped her boots on the mat and pulled off her gloves, and Mrs. Briggs looked up from the sink and said something about lunch being ready in an hour, and Eleanor said thank you and hung her coat on the hook behind the door. She went to wash her hands in the small basin off the kitchen, and she was standing there with the water running cold over her wrists when Constance appeared in the doorway. "There is a letter for you," Constance said. Eleanor turned off the water. "For me?" she said. Constance held it out. It was a white envelope, slightly smaller than the Cavendish invitation had been, and on the front, in handwriting she did not recognize, was her name, Miss Eleanor Hartwell. Just her name, not the family name, not the house, just her. "It came with the post," Constance said. "The rest was mine and Mother's." Eleanor took the envelope. She was aware of Constance watching her, of the particular quality of attention Constance was paying to this moment, and she did not look up to meet it. She looked at the envelope in her hands, and she turned it over, and on the back was a small circle of navy wax with the Cavendish crest pressed into it. Her hands were steady. She said, "Thank you," to Constance, and she went out of the kitchen and up the stairs to her room, and she closed the door, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, and she held the envelope for a moment without opening it. Then she opened it. The letter inside was one page, written in a hand that was unhurried and even, not ornate, not stiff, just clear and direct, as though the person writing had known what they wanted to say before they sat down. It began with her name, without prefix, which was slightly irregular and which she found she did not mind. It said that he had made an inquiry that morning with a bookseller in London whom he sometimes corresponded with, regarding the collection of letters from Provence she had mentioned. The bookseller had confirmed that a copy was available. He had asked that it be held. He wondered whether, if she wished, he might have it sent to her, as a small acknowledgement of a very enjoyable conversation. He said that he hoped she had arrived home safely, and that the ball had not been too exhausting. He said that he had found himself this morning thinking about what she had said, about how returning somewhere is like meeting something again for the first time, and that he thought she was right, and that it was a way of thinking about it he had not had before. He signed it Edmund Cavendish, not Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, just the name. At the bottom, below the signature, there was a single additional line, written as though it had been added after he had already finished the letter, and perhaps set down his pen, and then picked it up again, because there was one more thing. He asked if she would permit him to call, should he find himself passing near Ashford in the coming weeks. Eleanor read the letter twice, then she folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it in the drawer of her bedside table, under her Bible, which she chose not to examine too closely as a choice of hiding place. She sat still for a moment. Then she got up and went downstairs to help with lunch. She was very careful about her face, and her face gave nothing away, and she was quite proud of this, and she knew that Constance was watching her, and she carried the knowledge of the letter like a small, warm weight in her chest, and she thought, again, about not constructing things that were not yet built. She thought she was doing reasonably well at it. She thought it was getting harder. She wrote back that afternoon. She sat at the small writing desk in her room with a clean sheet of paper and the pen she used for correspondence. Not the good pen, which she kept for formal letters, but the everyday one, which suited this better. And she wrote carefully. She thanked him for writing. She said she would be glad to have the book sent. She said the journey home had been safe and not at all exhausting, and that the ball had been a very fine evening. She said she had thought more about what he said, that returning somewhere was like meeting it again for the first time, and she thought it was true for people as well as places, that a person who has been away for 4 years has themselves changed enough that returning home is, in a sense, two strangers meeting, the home, and the person who left it. She said he was very welcome to call, should he find himself in the neighborhood. She read it back once. She did not change anything. She put it in an envelope and addressed it to him, and left it on the hall table for the morning post. Then she went back to the kitchen garden until dark, pulling the dead stems from the beds that were finished for the season, clearing the way for whatever would grow in the spring. The book arrived 3 days later. It came in a brown paper parcel, wrapped neatly and tied with string, addressed to her. Inside the paper was the book, a slim volume, clearly old, the spine slightly worn, and tucked inside the front cover was a small card. The card said only, "I hope you enjoy reading it again, or perhaps meeting it again for the first time." Eleanor stood in the hallway with the parcel and the book and the card, and she felt something she could not entirely name, which was perhaps because it was made of several things at once. Millicent appeared from the sitting room and asked what had come. Eleanor said it was a book she had ordered. Millicent said, "Oh," and went back to the sitting room. Constance, coming down the stairs at that moment, looked at the parcel and then at Eleanor, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she continued down the stairs and through the entrance hall toward the kitchen without stopping. Eleanor went up to her room and sat by the window with the book. She did not open it immediately. She held it in her lap and looked out the window at the garden, which was very still and gray and bare, the way November gardens are, and she thought about the fact that in the south of France the olive trees were probably still green, still holding their small gray-silver leaves, still full of the particular light that 3 different writers had each tried, and each partially failed to describe, because some things resist description without resisting being true. She thought about how a man she had met 4 days ago had found a copy of a book she had mentioned in a single sentence of conversation, and had sent it to her with a note that proved he had actually listened to what she had said rather than simply nodding through it. She thought about what Constance had said. It is not about the book. She thought that Constance was probably right. She opened the book. The first letter was dated June of 1882. It began, "I have arrived and everything is different from what I imagined, and nothing is disappointing, which I was not expecting." Eleanor read until the lamp needed filling. Outside, the November evening settled into full dark, and the house sounds came and went around her. Her mother's footsteps, the click of the kitchen door, Millicent laughing at something on the floor below, and Eleanor sat in the yellow light with the old book and read the letters of a woman who had gone somewhere she had never been, and found that the world was both larger and smaller than she had known, which is perhaps what happens when you go anywhere at all. She fell asleep with the book open on the quilt beside her, and the lamp burning low, and the window showing her a sky with no stars. She did not dream about anything in particular. But in the morning when she woke, the first thing she thought about was not the garden or the kitchen accounts or the linen or any of the ordinary things. The first thing she thought about was a card, sitting on her bedside table, in a hand that was clear and direct and unhurried, that had said, or perhaps meeting it again for the first time. She lay still for a moment and allowed herself to feel whatever it was she was feeling without naming it or managing it or reducing it to something more practical. Then she got up and went about her day. Outside the window, the November sky was just beginning to lighten, gray to silver, at the very edge of the east, and a single rook was calling from somewhere in the chestnuts at the gate, and Hartwell Manor was quiet and cold and waiting, as it always was, for the morning to begin. And somewhere 3 miles away, in the old stone house at the end of the long oak drive, a man was perhaps also waking, in rooms that smelled of good fires and beeswax and the particular cold of a very large house in the early morning, and he was perhaps lying in the dark the way she had been lying in the dark, thinking about the same conversation she was thinking about, from the other side of it. Perhaps. She did not know. She went downstairs to start the morning. He came on Tuesday. Not the following Tuesday, which would have seemed urgent, and not 2 or 3 weeks later, which might have seemed like the letter had been a polite gesture without much behind it. He came 9 days after the ball, on a Tuesday morning in mid-November when the sky was the color of old pewter and the lanes of Kent were deep in wet leaves. Eleanor did not know he was coming. She was in the kitchen with Mrs. Briggs when Polly came in from the hallway with an expression that Eleanor had learned to read very precisely over the years, a slightly wide-eyed, slightly breathless expression that meant something was happening at the front of the house that Polly did not quite know how to categorize. "There is a carriage at the gate," Polly said, "a very good carriage." Eleanor looked at her. "The Cavendish crest is on the door," Polly added. Mrs. Briggs made a sound that was not quite a word. Eleanor took off her apron. She smoothed her dress, a plain gray wool that she wore most mornings, nothing special, nothing designed for receiving visitors of any kind, and certainly not this kind of visitor. She looked down at herself briefly, considered whether this mattered, decided it did not, and walked out of the kitchen into the hallway. Constance was already at the top of the main staircase. She had heard the carriage, or more likely she had been watching from her sitting room window, which faced the front of the house, and she was descending the stairs with a composure that suggested she had been preparing for this possibility, which Eleanor suspected she had been. Constance was wearing a very good morning dress, deep green with small covered buttons at the cuffs, her hair done properly, her color slightly higher than usual. She looked at Eleanor when she reached the bottom of the stairs. She looked at Eleanor's gray dress, and then she looked at her face, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not have revealed something she did not want revealed. The knock at the front door came. Polly, who had followed Eleanor into the hall, went to open it. Arthur Brent, the private secretary, was on the step. Behind him, on the drive, the carriage stood with its horses patient, and its coachman motionless on the box. Arthur Brent said in his careful, precise manner that the Duke of Ashford had been passing through the area on estate business, and had hoped to pay his respects to the Hartwell family, if they were at home, and if it was not inconvenient. He asked in a way that made clear the inconvenience was not a serious concern, and the being at home was not in doubt. Polly looked at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded. Polly stepped back and said they were very glad to receive him. Edmund Cavendish came up the front steps of Hartwell Manor in a dark coat with a wool scarf at the collar, and he removed his hat as he crossed the threshold, and he looked first at the hallway, taking it in with the brief, honest assessment of someone who is genuinely curious about a new place, and then at the two women standing in it. He said good morning to Constance. He said her name correctly and bowed his head. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," Eleanor said. "You are very welcome." He was shown into the sitting room. Constance led the way with a fluency that was unmistakable. She had been in charge of the sitting room and its arrangements since she was 20, and she moved through it with the confidence of someone on home ground. She indicated the best chair without appearing to indicate it. She positioned herself at an angle that allowed her both to address the visitor and to see the door, which was a detail that told Eleanor quite a lot about what Constance was thinking. Their mother arrived from the upper floor, having been sent for by another whispered message from Polly, and she came in slightly breathless but managing it well, saying something warm and general about the pleasure of his visit. Tea was brought. Mrs. Briggs had clearly acted very quickly, because the tray was immaculately arranged with the good china and a plate of small shortbread biscuits that were still warm, which meant they had been made that morning for no reason in particular and now appeared, fortuitously, ready. The conversation was general for the first several minutes. Edmund spoke with their mother about the county, about the changes to the estate since his father had managed it, about the repairs being done to the north wing of Cavendish Hall, which had been neglected for some years. He was easy to speak with in this general way, not performing interest, but genuinely responding to what was said, asking questions, listening. Constance spoke well. She always spoke well. She brought up a topic she had clearly researched at some point, the restoration of the East Wing's plasterwork, which had been mentioned in the local newspaper, and which she discussed with enough specific detail to convey careful preparation without appearing to have prepared. She was skilled at this. Edmund responded to it naturally, without any apparent awareness of the scaffolding behind it. Eleanor, sitting slightly to one side with her cup of tea, spoke when spoken to and said what was true, and did not volunteer performance of any kind. At some point, she was not sure how long into the visit, Edmund looked at her and said, "Did the book arrive?" "Yes," she said. 3 days after your letter." "Was it as you remembered?" "Better," she said. She describes a market in Aix-en-Provence in the 4th letter that I had forgotten entirely. She spends 2 pages on a kind of sausage she ate from a vendor who, she says, had been selling from the same corner for 40 years, and she traces the flavor back to the specific herbs he used, which he grew himself in a pot behind his house, and she concludes that all good food has a biography. Edmund looked at her for a moment. Constance was very still on the other side of the room. "All good food has a biography," Edmund said. "That is what she says." He considered this, and he appeared to find it worth considering, which Eleanor noted with a quiet satisfaction she did not show. "I will read it this week," he said. "It is a short book," Eleanor said, "but it is dense, not in a difficult way, dense in the way of things that have a great deal in them, and do not waste space." He nodded. The visit lasted exactly the correct length of time, which Eleanor later thought was something only people with a genuine social intelligence could manage, not so short that it seemed perfunctory, not so long that it became either intimate or burdensome. He rose at the right moment, thanked their mother very warmly, thanked Constance, and then turned to Eleanor. "I wondered," he said, and he said it simply, without preamble, To the room in general as much as to her in particular. Whether Miss Hartwell might care to walk out to the kitchen garden, she mentioned, if it is not too cold. I am told she has made rather remarkable improvements to it. Eleanor blinked. He met her eyes. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes held the same thing she had seen in them at the ball, that quality of direct, genuine attention, like a door that was open, rather than one that only appeared to be. You were told? She said. Mrs. Fentham mentioned it, in a letter I received from her yesterday, he said. She wrote to thank me for including her at the ball, and she mentioned, among other things, that she had spent most of the evening talking with the youngest Hartwell daughter about soil preparation and crop rotation, and that she had found it the most genuinely interesting conversation she had had in 6 months. Eleanor looked at him. She felt something moving in her chest that she was going to have to be careful about. She is very kind, Eleanor said. She is also very accurate, he said. Their mother said the garden was certainly worth seeing. Constance said nothing. Eleanor stood up. She took him through the kitchen, past Mrs. Briggs, who was studiously and audibly busy, and out through the back door into the cold November air. They crossed the wet grass to the gate in the old stone wall that surrounded the kitchen garden, and Eleanor pushed it open, and they went in. The garden was not beautiful in November. She wanted to say this before he looked at it, because she knew what it looked like. Turned earth and bare frames and the structural skeletons of things that would grow again in spring. None of it particularly impressive to an eye that did not know what it was seeing or what it would become. But he walked along the beds slowly, and he looked at them with the same attention he brought to everything, and he asked questions that showed he was not pretending to be interested. He asked about the raised beds, why the height, what she had used for the frame, how long they had taken to build. He asked about the rotation she mentioned, and she explained it in practical terms. 3 years for most things. 4 for root vegetables, letting the beds rest in order. He crouched down at one point to press his gloved hand against the dark soil of the resting bed, and he said it was in good condition, which it was, and she said she had spent the last 2 autumns improving it. They walked to the south wall. Eleanor said, in summer, there is a vine trained against this wall. Grapes, though not very good grapes, but the wall is what matters. It holds the heat from the south sun and keeps the beds nearest to it about 3 degrees warmer than the rest of the garden. It is enough to grow things that would not otherwise be possible here. Edmund stood with his back to the wall and looked out at the garden, at the gray November sky above the beds, at the bare kitchen garden that was, in its own way, already preparing for what it would become. You built this, he said. Over 5 years, she said. The original kitchen garden was here, but it was in poor condition. The beds had not been properly maintained. The soil had been depleted. What made you start? Eleanor thought about how to answer this honestly. The house needed food, she said. That was the practical reason. And I found that I liked working with something where the results were visible and the work was real. You put the effort in, and you can see it, eventually. There is not much in a household that works that way. He looked at her steadily. No, he said, there is not. They stood for a moment in the cold garden, and the stillness between them was not uncomfortable. It was the stillness of 2 people who have said something real and are allowing it to sit in the air for a moment, the way you allow bread to prove, or ground to rest, or any living thing that needs time before it is ready to take the next step. I should not keep you in the cold, he said at last. I do not mind the cold, she said. I know, he said. And he said it gently, not as a challenge or a judgment, but as a simple observation about the kind of person she was. But I will come again, if I may, and perhaps you might show me what this looks like in spring. She looked at him. Spring is a long way off, she said. It generally is, he agreed. That does not make it less worth waiting for. They walked back to the house together through the cold, and the wet grass left dark marks on her boots, and his coat was damp at the shoulders where the slight mist had settled, and the kitchen door was warm and bright ahead of them, and Constance was somewhere inside the house being entirely composed about everything. He said goodbye at the front door, properly, formally, with Arthur Brent appearing from the carriage like a man who had been counting minutes from a distance. Edmund put his hat back on and walked down the front steps, and Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched the carriage move back down the drive toward the lane. She stood there even after the carriage was out of sight. Polly, passing behind her with a bundle of laundry, said nothing. Mrs. Briggs, from the direction of the kitchen, said something about lunch. Eleanor turned and came inside and closed the door, and she thought that spring was indeed a long way off, and that it was also, in a way she could feel distinctly now, very much closer than it had seemed last week. Constance found her in the hallway. She appeared from the sitting room doorway, still in her green morning dress. and she looked at Eleanor with the expression of a person who has spent the last half hour in very focused thought and has arrived at a position. He asked to see the garden, Constance said. Yes. He specifically asked for you. He asked if I would care to show it. In front of Mother and me. Constance folded her hands in front of her, publicly. Eleanor said, I am aware of what happened, Constance. I was there. Constance looked at her for a long moment, then she said, He is coming back. He said he might. He will come back, Constance said, more firmly, as though correct assessment were a form of control. And when he does, you need to. I need to be myself, Eleanor said quietly. Constance stopped. It was not often that Eleanor interrupted her, and it was not often that Eleanor said something in a tone that suggested the conversation was moving in a direction she intended to direct. Eleanor was generally the family member who yielded, who accommodated, who found the smoothest path around conflict rather than through it. Constance looked at her. I need to be myself, Eleanor said again, in the same quiet voice. Because that is apparently why he came. Silence. Mrs. Fentham told him about the garden, Eleanor said. Not the ball, not the dress, the garden. Because I talked about it, and she listened, and she thought it was worth mentioning to a man she has known for years. She looked at her sister steadily. I will be glad to see him again if he comes, and I will be exactly who I am when he does. I think that is the correct approach. Constance was very still. Something moved across her face. It was not quite the emotion Eleanor had expected, whatever emotion she had been braced for. It was something quieter and more complicated than anger. It was something that looked, briefly, like the face of a person who has been doing a calculation for a very long time, and has just arrived at an answer that is different from what they expected. You might be right, Constance said. She said it very quietly. Eleanor looked at her. You might be right, Constance repeated. I would not have predicted that, but you might be. She turned and went back into the sitting room. Eleanor stood alone in the hallway for a moment. Then she went to help with lunch. He came again the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. The visits had a rhythm to them by the third one. The carriage at the gate, Arthur Brent at the door, tea in the sitting room with their mother and Constance present, and the conversation general and polished, and then, at some point in each visit, a natural movement of the exchange that brought him and Eleanor into a conversation that was different from the one happening around it. Not private, not excluding anyone, just more real. On the second visit he brought the book back. He had read it in 3 evenings, he said, and she had been right that it was dense without being difficult. He said the letters got better as they went on, that the woman's voice became more confident around the 6th letter, as though she had spent her first 5 letters finding her way into the new place and the new self it required of her. Eleanor said she had noticed the same thing. On the third visit he talked about the estate, not in the general way he spoke of it to others, not as property and responsibility and the management of things, but more specifically, as a place he was learning to know again after a long absence. He described a particular field at the southern end of the Cavendish land that had, when he was a child, been full of ox-eye daisies every June, and which had been turned to a managed pasture during his years abroad, and which he was considering returning to its previous state. Eleanor asked what it would take. He said he did not know yet. He was going to ask someone who knew about these things. Eleanor said that meadow restoration was a slow process, that you could not simply let a managed pasture go and expect the wildflowers to return, because the seed bank in the soil would have been disrupted by years of a different use, and you had to introduce the right seeds and manage the competition from the grasses carefully, and it could take 4 or 5 years before the results were genuinely beautiful, and that in the meantime it would look, to most observers, like very little was happening. He listened to all of this with complete attention. He said, You know a great deal about this. She said, I have had failures of my own to learn from. He smiled, not the polished social smile she had seen him use in the ballroom, the real one. I would like your advice, he said, when the time comes. Eleanor said she would be glad to give it. He was looking at her in that steady, direct way, and the room was full of the ordinary sounds of an afternoon in November. The fire settled and the wind at the windows, and her mother's soft movement in the hallway beyond the door, and Constance sitting very composed across the room with her embroidery, watching nothing in particular. Eleanor looked back at him. She thought about what she had said in the hallway to Constance. I need to be myself, because that is apparently why he came. She thought it was still true. She thought it might be the truest thing she had said in a long time. The fourth visit, when it came, was on a Tuesday morning in early December, when the ground had gone hard with the first proper frost of the season, and the garden was silver and still, and the sky was bright and very cold. And Edmund Cavendish came into the sitting room and said, after all the necessary general pleasantries had been completed, that he had something he wanted to ask Eleanor. He said it to the room, openly, including her mother in the statement with a look that was a form of courtesy that Eleanor recognized as quite deliberate. Their mother looked at him, then she looked at Eleanor, then she looked at her hands. Constance looked at the fireplace. Eleanor looked at Edmund. Ask it, she said. He asked if she would come and see the field. The field at the southern end of the Cavendish estate, the one he had described, the one that had been full of ox-eye daisies when he was a boy, and was now managed pasture, and that he was considering returning to something closer to what it had been. He said he had spoken to his head gardener, a man named George Hinton who had been at Cavendish for 30 years, and Hinton had said the project was possible but complicated, and that he needed someone who understood the relationship between soil and wild growth, and that he had thought of Eleanor. I would value your opinion, he said, practically, about the state of the ground and what it would require. Eleanor looked at him. You want me to come and look at a field, she said. Yes, he said. In December. The ground is frozen, he said, which is actually a useful time to see what the drainage situation is, Hinton agreed. Eleanor glanced at her mother, whose expression was carefully composed around what was evidently something she was choosing not to say. Then she looked at Constance. Constance had set down her embroidery and was sitting with her hands folded and her face entirely neutral, which Eleanor had learned years ago was not the same as her face being empty. When Constance's face was neutral, it meant she was working hard, and what she was working on was invisible. Eleanor looked back at Edmund. When were you thinking? She said. Thursday morning, if the weather holds. It is a short drive from here. Hinton will meet us at the field. Your mother or your sister would be very welcome to come as well, of course. He said this last part properly and included it in his address to the room, which was the correct thing to do, and which he did without any appearance of it being a formality. Their mother said that she was afraid she had an engagement on Thursday, but that she hoped Eleanor would enjoy it. Constance said she had letters to write. Eleanor said she would be glad to come on Thursday. Edmund stayed a little longer after that, long enough for the visit to resolve itself naturally rather than ending on the business of the invitation, and when he left, Arthur Brent materializing at the right moment as always, Eleanor stood at the doorway and watched the carriage go, and then came back into the sitting room. Her mother was already by the window. Eleanor, she said, in a voice that had a great deal in it. Mother, Eleanor said. He is a serious person, Catherine Hartwell said. Yes, Eleanor agreed. He comes every Tuesday. He does. Her mother turned from the window and looked at Eleanor directly, which she did not always do. She was a woman who had learned, over years of a household that Constance managed and daughters who each moved in different directions, to communicate through implication and suggestion rather than directness. Direct was tiring. Implication was easier, and often achieved the same result. But she was looking at Eleanor directly now, and her expression was complicated, and beneath the complication was something Eleanor was not used to seeing there. It looked, she thought, like a kind of recognition, as though she was looking at her youngest daughter and seeing something she had not expected to see. Be careful, Catherine said. Of what? Eleanor said. Of expecting nothing, her mother said. You have made a habit of it. It has served you. But sometimes expecting nothing is simply a way of protecting yourself from disappointment, and sometimes that is not wisdom. Sometimes it is fear dressed up as wisdom, and you cannot always tell the difference from the inside. Eleanor was very still. Her mother looked at her for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the window and said something about the cold and whether Mrs. Briggs had remembered to bring the parsley in before the frost, and the conversation was over, or at least that part of it was. Eleanor went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and she thought about what her mother had said. She had not expected it. Her mother was not a woman she associated with precise observation, not because Catherine was not observant, but because she had spent so many years directing her observations through the lens of Constance, who was easier to understand, and to whom Catherine had deferred for so long that it had become structural. Eleanor was the one who managed things, and Millicent was the one who was cheerful, and Constance was the one who was in charge, and that was how it had been for so long that it had come to feel permanent. But perhaps, Eleanor thought, it was not permanent. Perhaps it was just a habit that had hardened. She thought about what her mother had said. Expecting nothing is sometimes fear dressed up as wisdom, and you cannot always tell the difference from the inside. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about what she had said to herself, repeatedly, since the night of the ball, not to construct things that were not yet built. She had said it to herself as a form of protection. and she had believed it was wisdom, and perhaps it was. But perhaps it was also, at least partly, what her mother said. Fear. The fear of a person who has learned that wishing for things leads to not getting them, and who has therefore stopped wishing, and who has told herself this is good sense rather than a wound. She sat with this for a while. She did not come to any particular conclusion. She simply let the thought be there, the way she let the soil rest in autumn, not forcing it, not adding anything to it, just letting it be what it was, and seeing what it did with the time. On Thursday morning, the weather held. It was cold, very clear, the sky the pale hard blue of December at its most beautiful, the ground silver with frost that had not lifted even by 9 o'clock. Eleanor dressed carefully, not elaborately, because elaborate would have been false and she was done with false, but with care, which is a different thing. A good wool coat that she had not worn much because it was too good for most of what she did, but which was dark and clean and fit her well. Good boots, good gloves, her brown hair simply done, smoothed and pinned, clean. She looked at herself in the small mirror. She looked like herself. That was all she needed to look like. The Cavendish carriage came at 9:30. She was ready and at the door before it fully stopped, which she did not do because she was eager, but because she was a punctual person, and being ready was simply what punctuality meant. Edmund was in the carriage. He handed her up himself, before the footman could manage it, and she stepped in and sat across from him, and Arthur Brent, who was riding on the box with the coachman today instead of inside, had the good sense to make this arrangement seem entirely natural. They drove through the frost-bright lanes for 20 minutes. Edmund talked about the estate as they drove, not with the overwhelming detail of a man who wants to display knowledge, but with the particular affection of someone who has grown up knowing a place and is in the process of relearning it as an adult. He pointed out a copse of beeches that had been planted by his grandfather as a windbreak and had grown into something his grandfather would not recognize. He said that the estate had about 800 acres, of which perhaps 300 were farmed by tenants, and the rest was home farm, woodland, or the house and its immediate grounds. He said the tenants were mostly long-established families who had farmed the same fields for generations, and that he thought this was a good thing, and that his main job as far as the estate was concerned was not to interfere with what was working. Eleanor asked about the ones where things were not working. He said there were 2 tenancies that had been in difficulty. One family whose main working man had been ill for the past year, one field that had drained poorly for decades and needed serious attention before anyone could farm it properly. Eleanor asked about the drainage field. He said the problem was a clay pan about 2 feet below the surface that water could not penetrate. To fix it, you needed to break through the pan, which meant deep tilling or drainage channels, both of which were expensive, and neither of which the previous estate management had been willing to fund. "Will you fund it?" Eleanor asked. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. She looked at him. "It is a field that has not produced what it should for 30 years, because the infrastructure beneath it was wrong," he said. "That is a problem with a solution. If the solution is expensive, it is still the right thing to do. The tenants cannot fix it from above. The fix has to come from ownership." Eleanor thought about this. She thought about the kitchen garden at Hartwell Manor, about the years she had spent improving soil that had been depleted long before she arrived in it. She thought about the raised beds she had built from old timber, and the grit she had added to the clay beds, season by season, until they were what she needed them to be. "The right fix takes time to show results," she said. "I am aware of that," he said. "I am patient." The carriage stopped at the edge of a large field. It was exactly as he had described, flat, frozen, dull in the way of managed pasture, with none of the texture and variety that a wildflower meadow would have had. You could see the tire marks from farming equipment in the frozen grass, and the uniformity of the turf, cut and managed into submission. At the far edge of the field, a stone wall ran along the boundary, and beyond it, the land dropped away slightly, and you could see across the valley to the low line of woodland on the other side. George Hinton was waiting for them at the field gate. He was a compact man of perhaps 60, with the permanently wind-burned face of someone who worked outdoors in all seasons and had arrived at an age where the weather no longer surprised him. He shook Eleanor's hand with a practical directness that she appreciated, looking at her with the assessing but not unfriendly look of a professional who is deciding whether the person in front of him knows what they are talking about. He showed them the field. He showed them the areas where the turf had the specific flattened, even quality of long-managed pasture, every wildflower species long since grazed or cut away, the seed bank in the soil disrupted over decades of the same use. He showed them the drainage, good in the center, a wet section in the northeast corner that held water in heavy rain, and which would complicate any restoration attempt. Eleanor asked questions. She asked about the history of the field's use. how long it had been managed pasture, what had been grown before that, whether there were any records of what the original meadow had contained. Hinton had some of this information and not all of it. He said the ox-eye daisies the Duke had mentioned were confirmed by estate records from the 1870s, which gave them some information about what the original plant community had been. Eleanor crouched down at one point and pulled off her glove and pressed her hand to the frozen ground. It was very cold, a sharp cold that bit at her fingers immediately. She pressed carefully and then stood. "The soil is compacted," she said to Hinton. "More than I would expect even from the frost. Has it been driven on recently?" Hinton said the field had been used as a turning area for farm vehicles during the October harvest. Heavy vehicles on wet ground. The compaction went deep. Eleanor straightened and looked across the field. "The compaction is your biggest problem in the northeast corner," she said. "Not just the drainage. You will need to address both. If you aerate first and then put in drainage channels, and then leave it for a full season without any vehicle traffic, the soil structure should begin to recover." She paused. "And I would not rush the seeding. One season of recovery first, perhaps two, and then a targeted seed mix for your particular conditions. You want to match what is actually there, clay-tolerant species, nothing demanding. Yellow rattle early, to suppress the grasses." Hinton was looking at her with an expression that was no longer assessing. He was listening. Edmund was standing slightly back, watching them both. "Yellow rattle," Hinton said. "That is interesting. I had considered it, but was not sure of the timing. September is best," Eleanor said. "It needs cold stratification to germinate properly, so you sow in autumn and let it go through the winter. By spring, if the ground has been prepared correctly, you should see the first seedlings, and by summer, the grasses will be weakened enough for the other species to establish." Hinton looked at the Duke. Edmund looked at Eleanor. "That is," he said, "extraordinarily useful." "It is only what the books say," Eleanor said, though she knew it was also what the garden had taught her, which was different, and in some ways more reliable. They walked the full perimeter of the field. The frost did not lift. Eleanor's fingers were very cold by the end of it, though she did not say this. The sky was still that particular hard blue, and the light was brilliant on the frozen grass, and from the far corner of the field you could see, between two large oaks at the boundary, a long view across the Kent countryside toward the low winter sun. Eleanor stood there for a moment and looked at it. She did not say anything. She simply looked, because it was worth looking at, the way some things are worth looking at without requiring you to explain why. Edmund came and stood beside her. They were not standing particularly close. They were simply two people standing at the edge of a field looking at the same view. After a moment he said, quietly enough that Hinton, who had stayed near the gate, could not have heard, "I am glad you came." Eleanor looked at the view. "So am I," she said. And she meant it. And she did not reach beyond that. And she did not manage it. And she did not dress it up or reduce it or make it smaller than it was. She said it, and it was true, and she let it be true. The drive back was quiet for the first few minutes, the pleasant quiet of people who have done something together and do not need to fill the space immediately afterward with words. Eleanor held her cold hands in her lap and they warmed gradually. Outside the carriage windows, the frost-bright lanes of Kent passed, the hedgerows bare, the fields silver and still. A crow lifted from a fence post as they drove past and flew low across a stubble field and did not look back. Edmund said after a while, "Where did you learn about yellow rattle?" Eleanor said, "A book to begin with, and then failure. I tried to establish a small wildflower section in the garden at Hartwell, and the grasses overwhelmed everything in the first 2 seasons. I found the issue eventually." "What made you keep trying after the first failure?" Eleanor thought about this. "I find failure instructive," she said. "When something does not work, it tells you something specific about what it needed that you did not provide. That is useful information. The only failure that is wasted is the one you do not look at." He was quiet. "When I was in Vienna," he said, after a moment, "there was a negotiation that I was involved in for nearly 8 months. Very complex. Very many parties with very different interests. And the goal was a trade agreement that would benefit everyone, or at least most people. We were very close at one point. I believed we were very close." He paused. "It fell apart in the final week. Someone changed their position. The whole structure came down." "What did you do?" "I spent 2 days feeling angry," he said, which was honest at least. "And then I went through every meeting, every communication, every conversation, and I found the point where it had begun to go wrong, which was not the final week at all. It was a meeting 3 months earlier, where I had made an assumption I should have verified. I had assumed alignment that was not actually there, and I had built on that assumption, and when it gave way, so did everything above it." "Did you manage to rebuild it?" Not in the same form, he said. But a smaller agreement was reached, 6 months later, that contained the most important elements of the original, which was not what we had wanted. But it was something, and it was real, and it has held. Eleanor looked at him. Something real that has held, she said. Yes. That seems to me worth considerably more than a large agreement that fell apart. He looked at her steadily. It does, he said. I have come to think so too. It took me some time. The carriage slowed at the turn into the Hartwell lane. Eleanor could see the chestnut trees at the gate, the two her grandfather had planted, bare now, their great branches reaching without leaves against the pale winter sky. May I ask you something? Edmund said. Yes, Eleanor said. When I first came to call, the first Tuesday, 9 days after the ball, were you surprised? Eleanor thought about how to answer this honestly. Not entirely, she said. You had mentioned at the end of the evening that you might call, and you had sent the letter, so there was some basis for expecting it. She paused. I was perhaps surprised that you came when you said you might. That is less common than it should be. He was quiet for a moment. I say what I intend, he said. I have noticed that, she said. The carriage came to a stop at the Hartwell gate. The footman opened the door. Eleanor began to gather herself to descend. Miss Hartwell, Edmund said. She looked at him. I would like, he said, slowly and carefully, as though he were placing each word in exactly the right position, to continue what we have begun here. Not only the field, all of it. He paused. I wanted to say that clearly. The footman was holding the carriage door. The cold December air came in. The chestnut trees stood bare and patient at the gate. Eleanor looked at Edmund Cavendish for a moment. She felt something in her chest that was large and quiet and entirely real. I would like that too, she said. She descended from the carriage. She walked to her front door. She heard the carriage move back down the lane behind her, and she did not turn around. And she stood on her own front step in the cold December morning, with her hand on the door handle for just a moment before she opened it. Inside, the house was warm, and Mrs. Briggs was in the kitchen, and somewhere upstairs Constance was writing letters or reading or doing the calculations she was always doing, and Millicent was probably dreaming about Philip Croft from Tonbridge, and their mother was probably sitting by the window in the sitting room thinking something she would not say. Eleanor came inside. She hung her coat and her good gloves on the hook by the door. She thought about the field, silver and frozen under the bright December sky. She thought about the view between the oaks, across the low winter countryside, and the crow lifting from the fence post and not looking back. She thought about what Edmund had said. I wanted to say that clearly. She thought that she had been wrong, slightly, about what wisdom required. Not entirely wrong. Not constructing things that were not yet built was still reasonable. But the building had begun, quietly, in 9 days of letters and visits and cold fields and real conversations. And it was real, and it had begun, and acknowledging that was not recklessness. It was honesty. She went to wash her hands and have her lunch. December moved quickly and then slowly, the way months do when you are watching them. The visits continued on Tuesdays. Edmund came each week, without fail, in the carriage with the Cavendish crest, with Arthur Brent quiet and professional on the box. And he sat in the Hartwell sitting room and drank tea and spoke with the family. And at some point in each visit the conversation would settle into one between him and Eleanor that was different from the rest, not excluding anyone, not rude, simply real. He brought her a book on wildflower meadow restoration from the estate library in early December, a serious book, not a pretty one, full of practical detail about soil management and seed timing and the specific conditions required by different plant communities. He had marked several pages with paper slips and written brief notes in the margins, questions mostly, in his small, clean hand, things he was uncertain about and wanted to discuss. Eleanor read it in 3 evenings and then brought it back with her own notes added in pencil alongside his. They spent the better part of a visit working through a section about drainage management that had produced different conclusions in each of them, and they argued about it, not unpleasantly but genuinely, each holding their position until the other presented something compelling enough to shift it. Eleanor shifted first, on the drainage timing question. He shifted on the question of the initial seed density, when she explained her reasoning from the vegetable garden, and the way overcrowded seedlings competed for light in ways that seemed to resolve themselves but actually produced weaker plants. Hinton, who had been told about the conversation by Edmund, and who had his own view, was apparently going to be the deciding voice. Eleanor found this entirely reasonable. Constance watched these visits with an attention she did not fully conceal. She participated in them. Correctly, she was a good conversationalist, and she engaged Edmund on topics she had prepared, and he engaged back with genuine courtesy, and the surface of these interactions was smooth and proper. But Eleanor, who knew her sister very well, could see the calculation behind the surface, and she understood what Constance was calculating. Constance was recalibrating. She had spent years managing the household on the assumption that she was the natural center of any room she was in. She was right about this, for the most part. She was the most striking of the three sisters, the most socially capable, the most prepared. She had built a life around this fact the way you build around a load-bearing wall, and it had served her. She had expected it to serve her at the Duke's ball, and in a straightforward sense it had. She had navigated the evening well. She had made an impression. She had done everything correctly. And yet the Duke had walked across the room and asked Eleanor to dance first. And then he had written to Eleanor. And then he had come to see Eleanor. And then he had come again, and again, and again, and each time it was the conversation with Eleanor that became real, and Constance was, for the first time in her adult life, in the adjacent room. She was handling this with the composure of a person who handles difficult things composedly, which is not the same as being unaffected by them. Eleanor was not unsympathetic. She understood what it cost Constance to sit in the sitting room each Tuesday and watch the man she had prepared for, had positioned herself for, had expected, look past her to her younger sister. Eleanor knew her sister well enough to know that Constance had not wanted Edmund Cavendish simply as a title or a property. She had wanted the life that came with it, and she had assessed herself correctly as a person who could manage that life well. She was not wrong. She would have been very good at it. But Edmund had not asked Constance to dance. And the reason, Eleanor thought, was not that Constance had done anything wrong. The reason was something simpler and less manageable, that there was something between Eleanor and Edmund that had begun in the moment he had seen her across a ballroom, sitting with an old woman and genuinely listening, and which could not be manufactured after the fact, no matter how correct the preparation. One evening in mid-December, after Edmund had gone and their mother had retired early, and Millicent had gone to write a letter to Philip Croft, Eleanor and Constance sat alone in the sitting room with the fire burning down. Constance said, without looking up from her embroidery, "Philip Croft came from Maidstone to call on Millicent this afternoon while you were upstairs." Eleanor said, "I know. I heard the carriage." "He is going to ask for her formally," Constance said. "Soon, I think. Perhaps before Christmas." "Is she happy?" "She is very happy," Constance said, with an inflection that suggested Millicent's happiness was simple in a way that Constance found both slightly enviable and slightly beside the point. A silence. "Constance," Eleanor said. Constance looked up. Eleanor looked at her directly. She had been thinking about what to say for several days, and she had decided to say it because not saying it was a kind of dishonesty between two people who had known each other their entire lives, and who deserved better from each other than polished surfaces. "I am sorry," Eleanor said, "for how things have fallen out. I did not arrange them this way." Constance was very still. "I know," she said. "I know you did not. If there were something I could have done differently." "There is not," Constance said, cutting her off, not rudely, but firmly. "There is nothing. It is not a matter of different choices. It is simply what happened." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "He saw you. He could not have seen me the same way because I am a different person. I am not saying this to be generous. I am saying it because it is accurate." Eleanor looked at her. "You are a different person," Constance said. "You have always been a different person from me. I have spent years thinking you were the lesser version and I was the original, and I was wrong about that, and I have been wrong about it for a long time, and I am aware of that now." The fire settled in the grate. Outside the windows, the December night was deep and cold. "I would not have given you the blue dress," Constance said, "if I had known." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "That does not mean I was right to do it when I didn't know," Constance said. "I want to say that." "I know that too." Another silence, long and not uncomfortable. Constance looked at the embroidery in her lap. She set it aside. She picked up her cup of cooling tea and held it with both hands the way she sometimes did when she was not performing anything. "I am going to write to Aunt Helena in Bath," she said. "She has been asking me to come and stay for months. I think I will go in the new year, for a few weeks." Eleanor looked at her. "There is a social circle there that I have not met properly," Constance said. "Aunt Helena has tried to introduce me several times. I have always had reasons not to go." She paused. "I think my reasons were less valid than I believed." Eleanor said, "I think Bath might suit you very well." Constance looked at her, and for a moment something crossed between them that was real and simple, and not complicated by anything else. A recognition between two sisters, clear as the frost outside, of what they were to each other, and what they had never managed to say. Constance said, "Yes, I think it might." She stood up and said goodnight and went upstairs, and Eleanor sat alone by the fire until it burned down to ash. Christmas came to Hartwell Manor, with the particular muffled quality that December always brought. The house quieter than other seasons, the lights shorter, the kitchen busier. Mrs. Briggs made mince pies and a pudding that had been started in October, and there were holly branches in the entrance hall, and the smell of beeswax and dried orange peel and firewood that Eleanor associated with childhood. Edmund sent a gift. It arrived on the 22nd of December, wrapped in paper and string, and it was addressed to the family, which was correct and appropriate. Inside the wrapping was a small box of preserved fruits from a confectioner in London, which was thoughtful and entirely suitable as a general family gift. But there was also a second, smaller parcel inside, tucked beneath the box of fruit, wrapped separately and addressed to Eleanor alone. Inside the small parcel was a seed packet. It was a packet of yellow rattle seeds, properly prepared. She could tell from the weight and the slight rattle of it when she held it that the seeds inside were mature and correctly stored. On the front of the packet, in his handwriting, was a single line. For September, E.C. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed with the seed packet in her hand. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and this was not the kind of thing that would produce tears. But she sat very still for a moment with the seed packet in her hand, and she felt something that was made of several things at once: warmth and gratitude, and something larger that she was still being careful about naming, though it was becoming increasingly clear what it was. He had listened to what she had said about yellow rattle, the timing, the cold stratification, the September sowing. He had found a source for correctly prepared seeds. He had thought about it and acted on it, not in a grand way, but in a specific and practical and entirely personal way. He had sent her seeds. She placed the packet in the drawer of her bedside table, beside his first letter. She wrote him a letter on Christmas morning, before breakfast, while the house was still quiet. She thanked him for the seeds. She told him she intended to trial them in a small section of the Hartwell garden first, before they committed to the full Cavendish field, because it would give them data about germination rate in these specific conditions before the larger project was staked on assumptions. She said this was both practical and, she admitted, a small act of selfishness, because she found she wanted a stake in the project, even a small one. She told him she hoped his Christmas was peaceful. She said she was looking forward to the new year. She meant both of these things. She sealed the letter and left it for the morning post, and then she went downstairs, and the house smelled of the pudding warming on the kitchen range, and Millicent was coming down the stairs in her dressing gown talking about Philip Croft, and their mother was in the sitting room looking at the holly branches with a private and gentle expression, and Constance was already at the breakfast table, composed and ready for the day, as she always was. Eleanor sat down. She poured her tea. Outside the kitchen window, the December garden was hard and still and silver with frost, and in the bedside drawer upstairs, a small packet of seeds was waiting for September. She picked up her cup. She let herself be glad. His reply to her Christmas letter came 3 days later, between Christmas and the New Year, arriving on a Tuesday morning when the post was slower than usual, and she had not expected anything. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, even before she had properly looked at it, which told her something about what her mind was doing when she was not paying attention to it. The letter was longer than his previous ones. He had spent Christmas at Cavendish Hall with a small gathering, 2 cousins and their families, an old friend from his time in Paris, and a retired diplomat who had been his mentor in Vienna, and who came every year and stayed a week. He described Christmas dinner in a way that was very specific about the food, which she found, given the book she had sent back and all they had said about food and biography, entirely deliberate and very much enjoyed. He said the estate was beautiful under the Christmas snow. There had been a light fall on Christmas Eve, enough to cover the ground and the rooftops but not enough to make the lanes impassable, and that he had walked out before breakfast on Christmas morning to the south field, the ox-eye daisy field, and stood in it in the snow and thought about September. He said that the new year felt, to him, like genuine beginning rather than merely calendar. He said he hoped she would permit him to call on the second Tuesday of January. He said he had a question he wanted to ask her. He said he thought it was better asked in person. Eleanor read this letter 3 times. She read it with careful attention each time, looking not only at what was said but at what surrounded it, the shape of the sentences, the way the letter moved through its content toward that final line. She was a person who read attentively, and she knew that a final line in a letter from someone who chose their words carefully was not an accident. He had a question he wanted to ask her. He thought it better asked in person. She set the letter down on the bedside table. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the window, where the gray January light of the last day of December was coming through at a low, flat angle, the way winter light does, without warmth but with a particular honesty. She thought about what the question might be. She did not allow herself to conclude anything specific. She was still being careful, and she thought the care was appropriate at this stage. There was a difference between hope and expectation, and she was managing to hold the first while releasing the second, which required a kind of internal balance she was working at. But she was honest with herself about this much. She knew what she wanted the question to be. She knew it clearly, and she had known it for some time, probably since the walk in the frost-bright field, when he had stood beside her at the far corner, and looked at the view between the oaks and said, quietly, that he was glad she had come. She had known it, beneath all the careful management, beneath all the sensible reminders about not constructing things too quickly, beneath all the practice of expecting nothing. She had known what she wanted, and she was, slowly, beginning to allow herself to want it. She replied to his letter on the same day. She said the second Tuesday of January would be very convenient, and she looked forward to it. She said she was glad the estate was beautiful in the snow. She said she hoped the new year brought him everything he was looking for. Then she added, because she was done with managing things into smaller shapes than they were. She said she thought it did feel like a genuine beginning too. The new year arrived. Millicent told the family on the 2nd of January that Philip Croft had formally written to their mother to ask permission to court her, and that she had of course said yes, and that Philip was going to come to Hartwell Manor on the Saturday to discuss the matter properly. Millicent said all of this over breakfast in a sustained burst of happiness that filled the room like a warm draft, and their mother made sounds of great contentment, and Constance said the right things with complete correctness, and Eleanor said she was genuinely happy for her, and meant it with all her heart. On the 4th of January, Constance left for Bath. She packed her best trunk and several smaller cases, and the carriage came in the morning, and Eleanor stood at the front door to see her off. They had not spoken about anything important since the conversation in the sitting room before Christmas, and they did not speak about it now. Constance kissed her mother's cheek, and kissed Millicent's cheek, and then she turned to Eleanor. She looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I hope it is everything you are hoping for." Eleanor said, "I hope Bath is everything you need it to be." Constance smiled, briefly and genuinely, and then she stepped up into the carriage, and it moved down the drive, and Eleanor watched it go. She stood there in the cold January morning for a moment, after the carriage had disappeared. Then she went inside, and she helped with the household, and she thought about Tuesday. Tuesday was 9 days away. 9 days. She went to the kitchen garden in the cold gray afternoons and turned the beds that needed turning and thought about spring. It was always furthest away right before it came. She worked in the garden every afternoon that week, even when the cold made it difficult, because working in the garden was the place where her mind cleared, and her thoughts organized themselves honestly, without performance, and without the noise of the house around her. On the 6th of January, she wrote in the small journal she kept on the shelf beside the Provence letters book, the journal she used not for events, but for things she was thinking about and wanted to examine more carefully. She wrote, "I have been afraid, for most of my life, of wanting things I was not certain I would receive. This has made me careful, which has been useful, but it has also made me small, in the way that caution without courage is small. I do not wish to be small anymore." She read this back once. Then she closed the journal and put it back on the shelf. Outside the window of her room, the January evening was dark and very still, and somewhere in the chestnuts at the gate, a bird was moving, and the bare branches were clicking together gently in a slight wind she could not feel from inside. 9 days. 8 days. She did not count the days. She simply noticed, each morning, that the number had changed. Tuesday came. He was there at 10:30, which was the time they had settled into without formally agreeing to it, late enough for the morning to have established itself, early enough that the day still felt full of possibility. Eleanor heard the carriage at the gate from the kitchen, where she was checking the larder inventory, and she heard Polly's light footsteps in the hall and the sound of the front door, and she set down the list she was holding and went to wash her hands. She was calm. She was very deliberately calm, which is not quite the same thing as being calm naturally, but she had found that if she acted calm for long enough, the acting and the fact of the thing eventually converged. She came into the entrance hall just as Edmund was giving his coat to Polly. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and the thing happened that had been happening for weeks now, a quality of attention in his face when he saw her that was entirely different from the general attention he brought to a room, and which she had stopped pretending she had not noticed. He said good morning. She said good morning. Polly took the coat. Without discussing it, without Polly having asked, without anyone having arranged it, they both turned and went not into the sitting room but down the hallway toward the kitchen door. Their mother was in the sitting room. Eleanor had heard her moving there, and Millicent had gone out that morning to see a friend. The house was quiet. Polly would bring tea in a moment, wherever they ended up. They went out through the back door and into the garden. The January garden was bare and cold and entirely without pretension, the beds dark and resting, the bare frame of the old pear tree against the south wall stark against the white sky. Their breath was visible. The ground was hard but not frozen, a January thaw having softened it slightly in the past 2 days. They walked. There was no particular direction to it. Eleanor moved along the edge of the beds with the particular ease of someone on entirely familiar ground, and Edmund walked beside her, close but not crowding, and neither of them said anything for the first minute or so, and that was fine. Edmund said, "I have been thinking about what I want to say all week." Eleanor said, "I am not going anywhere." He looked at her, and she thought she saw something in his expression relax slightly. Not nerves exactly, but the tension of a person who has been carrying a weight for a while and has just been told they can set it down. They stopped walking near the south wall. The bare pear tree was above them, the wall holding its cold and patient warmth even in January, and the sky was white and still. He turned to face her. He said, "I came to the ball in November because it was the expected thing. I arrived prepared to be polite to everyone and interested in no one in particular, because that has been my general experience of such events, and I had no reason to expect otherwise." He paused. "And then I saw you sitting with Agnes Fentham, and you were listening to her with a fullness of attention that I have rarely seen, and I asked my secretary who you were, and he told me you were the youngest Hartwell daughter, and I walked across the room and asked you to dance." Eleanor listened. "I have thought about that choice," he said, "every day since November. Why you? Why that moment? And I think the answer is simply that you were the most genuinely present person in the room, and I had spent 4 years in rooms full of people who were performing presence rather than actually being present, and the contrast was immediate and completely striking to me." He looked at her steadily. "And then we danced, and you talked about the poppies and the books and the olive trees, and I thought, this is what a real conversation feels like. I had forgotten." Eleanor held his gaze. "And then I wrote to you," he said, "because I could not think of a reason not to that was worth anything. And I came to call, for the same reason. And each time I came it became clearer to me that what I was feeling was not the result of novelty or curiosity or any of the things I checked it against, because those things fade, and this has not." He paused. "I am not a dramatic person," he said. "I do not make speeches, but I have something I want to ask you, and I want it to be clear, not hidden inside ordinary conversation, so I am going to say it plainly." Eleanor's hands were still at her sides. She was breathing carefully. "Will you consider marrying me?" he said. "Not now. I am not asking you to decide now, today. I am asking you to consider it, because I believe we are well matched in the ways that matter most, and because I am certain of what I feel, and because I would rather ask you plainly and give you the space to answer honestly than approach it from a distance and never quite arrive at the question." The garden was very quiet. The white January sky held everything in an even, still light. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, not calculating, not performing, just looking at him with the same full attention she brought to everything worth looking at properly. She said, "I have been thinking about this question since your letter in December, not because I assumed you would ask it, but because I was honest enough with myself to admit that I hoped you would." His expression changed, just slightly, something in it opening. "I do not need to consider it further," she said. "I have already considered it, carefully, for 3 weeks, and my answer is yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, as though trying the word in the air between them. "Yes," she said again. "Though I should tell you that I am not an easy person in some ways. I am stubborn about the things I believe are right, and I am not very good at pretending to think something I do not think, and I will argue with you when I think you are wrong, which I expect will be occasionally." A smile crossed his face, the real one. "I expect it will be," he said. "And I want to say this clearly, I am not a person who requires a great deal. I do not require elaborate things, but I require honesty, and I require to be spoken to directly, and I require to be genuinely considered." "I know," he said. "You have done all of these things," she said, "for 3 months. That is what my yes is based on, not the title or the estate or any of the other things, though I am not pretending they are irrelevant. What it is based on is that you are a person I trust to be honest with me, and that matters more to me than anything else." He stepped forward slightly, closing the small distance between them. "I will be honest with you," he said. "About everything. Always." She believed him. She believed him the way she believed the soil when it told her what it needed, or the way she believed the sky when it told her what the weather was going to be. Not because she was naive, but because she had learned to read things that were honest, and this was honest, and she knew the difference. "Then yes," she said. "The answer is yes." He took her hand. He held it carefully, her cold fingers in his glove, and she felt the warmth of his grip through the leather, and the garden was bare and quiet all around them, and the white sky held them both, and it was not a dramatic moment, nothing to be written up in the papers, or described in some elaborate way. It was simply two people, standing in a winter garden, who had found something real and decided to keep it. They walked back inside together, eventually, when the cold became insistent. Polly had brought tea to the sitting room and then apparently retreated, because the sitting room was empty when they came in. Their mother appeared from the hallway a minute later and looked at them both, and something in what she saw made her stop for a moment. And then she sat down and accepted the cup of tea Eleanor poured for her, and she said, in a very quiet voice, "I am glad." Edmund said he would need to speak with her properly, formally, in the correct way, and Catherine Hartwell said she quite understood, and she held her cup of tea with both hands and she looked out the window at the winter garden and she was, Eleanor saw, very genuinely glad. Edmund stayed for lunch. He stayed until the afternoon, which was longer than any previous visit, and the hours passed easily in the way that time passes when you are not watching it, the conversation moving without effort through the kitchen garden and the field and the Provence book and the meadow restoration and things that were not about any of those subjects but that used them as the frame for other, larger things. At some point Eleanor brought the packet of yellow rattle seeds down from her room and put them on the table between them, and he looked at them and picked them up and turned the packet in his hand with the same look she had seen him give interesting things, the look of someone actually regarding them. She told him her plan for the trial section in the Hartwell garden, which would give them germination data before they committed to the Cavendish field. He said it was an excellent plan. She said she had also been thinking about the drainage in the northeast corner of the field, and she had had an idea about an alternative approach that Hinton might not have considered. He said he would bring Hinton to her. "To me?" she said. "You should tell him yourself," he said. "Your reasoning is clearer than my summary of your reasoning would be." Eleanor looked at him. "You will have to become accustomed," he said simply, "to people listening to what you say." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I can manage that," she said. He left at 4 o'clock when the light was already beginning to go, which it does very early in January in Kent, the sky deepening from white to gray to the dark of early evening, almost before the afternoon has properly finished. Eleanor stood at the front door and watched the carriage go down the drive, and this time it was different from every other time she had watched it go. Not because of any single thing that was different, because of the weight of the morning, the words in the garden, the simplicity and the honesty of all of it. Because she had said yes and meant it with every clear and honest part of herself, and because he had heard her mean it, and because there was now a thing between them that had a name and a shape and would not dissolve by morning. She stood on the front step until the cold drove her in. Inside, her mother was in the sitting room, and when Eleanor came in, Catherine looked up and then looked at Eleanor's face, and she said, "Tell me." Eleanor sat down across from her. She told her. Her mother listened with her hands folded in her lap and her face moving through things she did not try to control, which was unusual. Joy first, and then something more complicated, and then something that was very old and very tender, that Eleanor did not have a full name for but that looked, she thought, like the expression of a woman who had spent a great deal of her life hoping for things, and finally seeing one of them come into being exactly as it should. "He is a good man," Catherine said, when Eleanor had finished. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He sees you." "Yes." Her mother looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "Your father would have liked him," she said. "He was not a person who was impressed by titles, but he was a person who respected honesty, and this young man is honest." Eleanor said quietly, "I know." They sat together for a while in the warmth of the sitting room, while the January night settled around the house and the fire burned and the sounds of the household moved gently around them. When Millicent came home from her friend's house and immediately began talking about Philip Croft, their mother interrupted her, very gently, and said, "Eleanor has something to tell you." Millicent turned and looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor told her, briefly, what had happened, and Millicent's face went through a complete transformation, first confusion, then understanding, then a happiness that was entirely and generously Millicent's, a happiness that had nothing complicated in it, nothing withheld, just pure genuine joy for her sister. She came around the table and hugged Eleanor with the enthusiastic physical warmth she had always had, even as a child, and she said something into Eleanor's shoulder that was mostly unintelligible because she was crying slightly, which was exactly what Millicent did when she was very happy. Eleanor held her and felt something in her own chest that was warm and full. That night, Eleanor wrote to Constance in Bath. She wrote a full and honest letter, not hiding anything and not protecting Constance from anything, because they had agreed, without words, on the night before Christmas, to be more honest with each other. She told Constance what had happened. She said she hoped Constance was well. She said she hoped Bath was doing what they had both hoped it would do. She said she thought of her often, and wished her well with a sincerity she meant entirely. She ended the letter. I am going to be very happy. I believe you are also going to find happiness, in whatever form it arrives. I am sorry it took me so long to understand what you are worth, and I am sorry that the household as we knew it did not serve you properly. You are very capable, and I hope the world gives you the room your capability requires. She sealed the letter and left it for the morning post. Then she took the packet of yellow rattle seeds from the drawer of her bedside table, and held it in her hand for a moment, feeling the weight of the small seeds inside, the subtle shifting sound they made when she tilted the packet. For September, EC. She put it back in the drawer. She turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, and outside the window, the January night was very quiet, and inside the house, everything was still. She thought about the field in September, the yellow rattle established, the grasses weakened, the first wildflowers beginning to come through into the space the yellow rattle had opened. You could not rush it. You could not make it happen faster than it happened. You could prepare the ground and choose the seeds and manage the conditions, and then you had to wait, and trust, and let the time be what the time needed to be. She had been waiting for a long time without knowing it. She had been preparing the ground, in her way, without knowing that was what she was doing. She closed her eyes. She thought, the ground is ready. She slept. Constance's reply came from Bath 4 days later. It was a short letter by Constance's standards, but what it said was complete. She said she was glad for Eleanor, and she said it without qualification and without any of the management Eleanor might have half expected. She said Bath was everything Aunt Helena had promised and more, and that she had been introduced to a circle of people who were exactly the kind of people she did well with, interesting, cultured, and not inclined to rank anyone's worth by the county they came from. She said there was a man she had met through Aunt Helena's friend who was a barrister from Bristol, intelligent and direct, and who had sought her company twice already at the same social gathering without any particular arrangement, which she was not yet concluding anything from, but which she was also not dismissing. Eleanor read this and felt something shift and settle in her chest. She wrote back, "Tell me about the barrister." She added, "I hope, when the time is right, that he sees you the way you deserve to be seen." She meant this entirely. She also thought, setting down her pen, that Constance was going to be very good at being seen by the right person, when the right person found her, because Constance was extraordinary in ways that the wrong room could not contain, and Bath, with its different air and different circles, might be exactly the right room at exactly the right time. She hoped it was. Edmund came on the following Tuesday with Arthur Brent and a letter in his coat pocket from his solicitor, which he gave to their mother and which she read with Polly's assistance, since Polly's eyesight was better than hers at small print, and which was the formal documentation of his intentions and the proposed terms of settlement, which were more than generous, and which Catherine Hartwell accepted with the dignity of a woman who has not expected generosity, and who receives it therefore with particular grace. The engagement was settled. It would be announced at the appropriate time. Edmund gave Eleanor his grandmother's ring, not a performance of it, no dramatic presentation, no moment staged for an audience. He simply took it from his pocket in the kitchen garden where they had ended up that Tuesday afternoon as they so often did, and he put it in her hand and said his grandmother had been a woman very unlike most people, in ways he had admired, and he thought she would have found Eleanor interesting. The ring was old gold with a single pale stone, simple and well-made, and entirely without excess. Eleanor put it on. She looked at it on her hand. "Is it right?" he said. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said. "It is exactly right." The announcement went into the county newspaper on the last Friday of January, a brief and formal notice in the traditional language of such things, the kind of notice that says very little but carries a great deal. Eleanor did not read the newspaper particularly. She knew the notice was there because her mother told her it had gone in, and because Mrs. Briggs mentioned it at breakfast on Saturday morning, in the particular tone of a woman who has read something carefully and is very pleased about what it said. And she knew it had been read by people she had not told, because the letters began arriving at Hartwell Manor before noon on Saturday. Not a flood, a steady trickle, each one arriving over the course of the following week, from county families and more distant connections, and women she had met twice at other people's events, and women she had never met at all of them warm, most of them genuinely so. A few of them warm in a way that had something else below the warmth, a particular careful warmth that is how people congratulate you for something they had not predicted and are still adjusting to. Eleanor answered each letter with care. She said thank you. She said she was very happy. She said she hoped to have the pleasure of their company soon. This was all true, and she said it without performance. There was a letter from Agnes Fentham, which arrived on the Monday, and which was the one Eleanor read first. It said, "I told him about the garden. I want you to know that. I told him because I thought it was worth telling, and because I had been watching him for 30 years being competent and responsible and doing everything correctly, and I thought he deserved to know that there was a person in the county who grew things in clay soil against the advice of people who knew less than she did. He listened with the specific attention he gives things that actually matter to him. I was glad to have been useful." Eleanor read this letter twice. She wrote back, "You were more than useful. You were essential." She also wrote, "The poppies will be in the Cavendish garden within 3 years. If I have anything to say about it, I will make sure of it." She sent the letter to Sevenoaks with a small jar of the preserved rosehip jelly she had made in October, which was very good that year. The county responded to the announcement in the way that counties respond to unexpected things, with a comprehensive reorganization of everything everyone had previously assumed, carried out in drawing rooms and over breakfast tables and in the small, confident exchanges between women who knew each other well enough to say exactly what they thought. Eleanor was not present for most of these conversations. She heard about some of them later, in bits and pieces, from Millicent, who had better social antennae than anyone else in the family, and who moved through these conversations naturally and without effort, and remembered almost everything she heard. Millicent said that the general opinion of the county settled, over the course of about a week, into a position that sounded like the county had always thought very well of Eleanor Hartwell and had always suspected her quality, which was not quite true but which was how memory works. It reorganizes itself to fit what is now known to be correct, because people prefer a coherent story to an honest one. Eleanor did not mind this. She found it more amusing than anything else. She minded the other conversations slightly more, the ones that were less generous, the ones that circled around the blue dress at the ball, which had of course been noticed and which had now become part of the story. She had heard, at second hand, that 1 or 2 women had said it was rather irregular that the Duke's future wife had attended his ball in borrowed clothes, as though this reflected something about the match or about Eleanor's fitness for it. She heard this and thought about it honestly, the way she thought about honest things. She decided it did not matter, not because she was above it, but because it was simply a smaller thing than the things around it, and she had found that giving smaller things the energy that belonged to larger things was a kind of waste she could no longer afford. She had larger things to think about. The question of where she and Edmund would live in the immediate term, for instance. Cavendish Hall was large and required managing, and Eleanor was not in any way intimidated by the managing of a household, but she was honest enough with herself to know that the scale of it was different from Hartwell Manor, and that she would need to learn the house the way she had learned the kitchen garden, slowly, by section, starting with what she understood and building from there. She had asked Edmund, on one of his Tuesday visits, if she could see the house properly. Not the ballroom and the staterooms. She had seen those at the ball. She wanted to see the house, the kitchen and the laundry and the storerooms and the staff quarters and the back gardens and the outbuildings. He had looked at her when she said this with an expression she was coming to know well, the expression of someone who has heard something they were hoping to hear, and who is pleased in a way that does not make a performance of itself. He said, of course. They visited on a Wednesday morning in early February, which was Edmund's choice of day because he wanted to take her when the house was in ordinary operation, not prepared for her arrival. His housekeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Greer, was a woman of about 60, stout, competent, with the particular manner of a person who has been excellent at their work for a very long time, and who has no particular need to demonstrate this because it is evident everywhere around them. She met Eleanor at the kitchen door rather than the front entrance, which was Eleanor's suggestion and which Mrs. Greer had accepted with a brief, appraising look that appeared to conclude something. Eleanor spent 3 hours with Mrs. Greer. She saw the kitchen first, the range, the cold larder, the dry store, the pantry with its rows of preserves and its system of organization that had been in place for 40 years and which worked extremely well. She saw the laundry room, with its copper and its drying lines, and the particular warmth that laundry rooms have even in February. She saw the housekeeper's room, which was small and tidy and contained, Eleanor noticed, a very well-read copy of a book on estate management, and a small vase of paper-white narcissi on the windowsill. She saw the staff hall, where the domestic staff took their meals, which held 10 people at the table and had a fire going and smelled of good plain cooking. She saw the back gardens, the kitchen garden, which was well-maintained and productive but which had some opportunities she could see at a glance, the walled garden with its espalier fruit trees and its structured beds, the cutting garden for flowers, all of it maintained by a team of 4 gardeners under Hinton's oversight. She asked Mrs. Greer questions throughout, and Mrs. Greer answered them with the directness of a woman who respected competence in others and who was, Eleanor thought, in the process of deciding whether Eleanor had any. At the end of the tour, standing in the walled garden in the February cold with the bare espalier pears behind them, Mrs. Greer said, "The kitchen garden needs the southwest beds relaid. The drainage has been wrong for 7 years and the soil has compacted. I have mentioned it 3 times. Eleanor said, "I will see to it." Mrs. Greer looked at her. "This spring," Eleanor said, "before planting." Something in Mrs. Greer's expression, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one, settled into place. "Very good, Miss Hartwell," she said. Edmund, who had been keeping a courteous distance during most of the tour, was waiting in the entrance hall when they came back in. He looked at Eleanor and then at Mrs. Greer, reading the air between them with the particular attention he brought to everything. Mrs. Greer said to him, "Miss Hartwell would like to see the library." "I would," Eleanor said. The library was at the south end of the house, facing the garden, and it was a room of such quality that Eleanor stopped just inside the doorway for a moment to look at it properly. Not because it was grand, though it was, but because it was genuinely a room for reading. The shelves were full and the books were used, not arranged for appearance, not dusted into submission. They had the particular quality of books that have been taken down and replaced many times, spines worn at the most read places, pages holding their memory of being turned. There was a large table for spreading things out, and 2 chairs by the window that had clearly held many hours of reading between them, the cushions shaped by use. Edmund stood beside her. She said, "This is a very good room." "It was my favorite room in the house," he said, "when I was a child. And now?" He looked at the room, and then at her, and he said, "I expect it will be again." They sat in the chairs by the window for an hour, not reading but talking, about the house, about what needed attention, about the kitchen garden and Mrs. Greer's assessment of the southwest beds, about the field and the yellow rattle and what September might look like if everything went as hoped. They talked about what they both wanted, practically, for the household and the estate. Edmund listened to her with complete and genuine attention, and she listened to him the same way, and they agreed on most things, and the 2 things they did not agree on, they discussed until one of them conceded, or they found a third position neither had started with. Eleanor sat in the good chair in the South Library and watched the February garden through the tall windows, bare and silver and already preparing, underneath the surface, for spring, and she thought that this was what it looked like when things were right. Not dramatic, not extraordinary, just real, and working, and hers. The wedding was set for April. Not a grand April wedding at the height of the season, not in London, not with 300 guests and a reception that lasted until midnight. A county wedding, a morning ceremony at the old stone church in Ashford where Eleanor had been baptized and where her father was buried in the churchyard on the south side, and a luncheon afterward at Cavendish Hall, and the people who mattered. Eleanor had expressed this preference on a Tuesday afternoon in February, sitting in the Hartwell sitting room with her mother and Edmund, and she had said it directly, because that was how she said things. And her mother had looked at her with an expression of slight surprise, and then an expression of complete understanding, and Edmund had said it sounded exactly right to him. The only large thing was the guest list, which required a certain number of people who were not personally known to either of them but whose absence would have been a discourtesy. County families, estate connections, Edmund's diplomatic acquaintances, a former colleague from Vienna who was now back in England. These were managed by Edmund's secretary, who turned out to have a considerable gift for this kind of management, and Eleanor did not interfere with it, because she understood that some things had their own correct mechanics, and the correct approach was to let them work. She focused on the things she could directly affect. She spent 3 weeks of February and March in the kitchen garden at Cavendish Hall, working alongside the head gardener and 2 of the young gardeners on the southwest beds that Mrs. Greer had mentioned. They broke the compacted soil to a full spade's depth, turned it twice, added good material from the compost heap and a measured quantity of sharp grit, and then let it settle for 2 weeks before they rebuilt the beds. George Hinton watched her work on the first 2 days, not interfering but observing, and on the 3rd day he arrived in the kitchen garden and began working alongside her without being asked, and that was that. By the time March ended and the beds were replanted, they had developed the particular working relationship of 2 people who understand each other in practical terms, without great warmth necessarily, but with mutual respect, which in Eleanor's experience was the more durable thing. Mrs. Greer sent down a jug of hot tea to the kitchen garden at 11 o'clock every morning while Eleanor was working there. She did this without being asked and without mentioning it, and Eleanor accepted it without comment and drank it gratefully, and understood that this was Mrs. Greer's version of a welcome, and valued it accordingly. The wedding day arrived on the 14th of April, 1909, a Thursday, with the sky entirely clear and the air cold in the morning and warming slowly as the day went on. Eleanor woke very early. She lay in her room at Hartwell Manor, which would stop being her room after today, and she looked at the ceiling, and she listened to the house. She heard the birds first, a wren somewhere very close, and further away a chorus of them in the garden, insistent and early. She heard Mrs. Briggs moving in the kitchen below, the sound of the range being stoked, the particular sequence of sounds that meant breakfast was being prepared. She heard Millicent, who had come back from Tonbridge for the wedding with Philip Croft's formal blessing already secured, and their own engagement now announced, moving in the room next door with the contained happiness that had been her dominant characteristic since October. She heard her mother's footsteps, slow and careful, from the far end of the passage. She lay still for a moment and let the house be around her. She was not afraid. She had thought, in the weeks before, that she might be afraid, of the scale of it, of the change, of the life she was walking into which was so different in its external form from the one she was leaving. She had half expected a morning like this to feel alarming. It did not. It felt, she thought, like the garden in early spring when you can see, just visible, the first green of new growth coming through the dark soil you prepared in autumn. You prepared for this. You knew it was coming. You have been moving toward it in every season since. She got up. She dressed with Millicent's help and her mother's presence, in the dress that had been made for her, not a great London dress but a very good one, made by a dressmaker in Maidstone who had been given Eleanor's instructions and had followed them exactly. A pale dress of a color that was neither cream nor gray but something between them, simply cut, well made, with no excess. She looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like herself. That was still enough. At the church, which smelled of candles and old stone and the narcissi that Eleanor had arranged herself, with help from Millicent and from Mrs. Fentham who had offered and whose opinion on flowers was worth having, a congregation of 120 people stood when she walked in. She walked in on no one's arm. Her father was dead, and she had no brother, and her mother had offered Constance's husband. Constance had, as predicted, found her person in Bath, a steady and direct barrister named William Keating, who had proposed in March, and who stood now in the Ashford church with Constance on his arm looking like the most satisfied man in the room, but Eleanor had declined. She walked in on her own. She walked steadily, and she looked forward, and the church was full of light from the south windows, and at the altar, Edmund turned when he heard the door, and looked at her as she came up the aisle, with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything since November, steady and real and entirely present. She reached him. She stood beside him. The vicar began. The words were the old words, unchanged for centuries, worn smooth by being said and meant by so many people, in so many places across so much time, and Eleanor heard each one and let it be real. When it came to her own words, she said them clearly and without hesitation. Afterward, in the bright April outside the church, with the churchyard and its old stones and the daffodils along the path and the sound of the bells that had begun the moment the vicar pronounced the final words, Edmund took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they stood together in the light. Mrs. Fentham, who was making her careful way down the church steps with the help of a stick and the attentive arm of a nephew, caught Eleanor's eye as she passed. She said nothing. She simply looked at her with an expression that said everything she needed to say, which was that she had known, on that evening in November in the ballroom at Cavendish Hall, that the youngest Hartwell daughter in the worn blue dress was worth watching. She had known it with the confidence of a very old woman, who has seen enough of the world to recognize something real when she is sitting beside it. Eleanor held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at Edmund, and he looked at her, and somewhere behind the church the bells were still ringing, bright and persistent and clear, carrying across the April country air. September came, as it always does, without announcement. One morning in late August, Eleanor looked out the kitchen window at Cavendish Hall and noticed that the quality of the morning light had changed. It was still warm, still the gold of late summer, but there was something different in the angle of it, a slight lowering, a hint of what was coming. The birch tree at the corner of the walled garden had one yellowing branch. The swallows were grouping on the telephone wires in the village a mile away, which meant they were preparing to leave. She said, to no one in particular, though Edmund was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Greer was going through the weekly household accounts. September. Edmund looked up. Mrs. Greer looked up. Eleanor took her coat from the hook by the door. She went out to the field. The south field had been left alone all spring and summer, as planned. No vehicles, no livestock, no cutting. The grass had grown long and untidy, which looked wrong if you did not know what was happening underneath it, and which had required explanation to at least 2 visitors who had assumed the field had been neglected. Eleanor had explained it both times with a patience she had cultivated specifically for this purpose, because she had learned that the work that looks like nothing is sometimes the hardest to explain. George Hinton met her at the gate with the expression of a man who has spent 5 months working hard at something and is ready to see the results. The drainage channels in the northeast corner had been cut in February, properly, the compacted clay pan broken through at depth, and the channels filled with stone and topped with good permeable material. All through the wet spring, Eleanor had watched the corner of the field carefully. The water moved through rather than sitting, which was the first evidence that the work had done what it was meant to do. In April, when the ground temperature was right, she and Hinton had begun the seeding. Not the yellow rattle yet. That needed autumn. But the first round of species that would form the matrix of the meadow, species that were adapted to these specific conditions, tolerant of the clay, comfortable with the drainage patterns of the field, native to this part of Kent and therefore suited to its particular character. She had spent 3 weeks in February reading and deciding, consulting books and then trusting what the garden had taught her over 5 years, and the seed mix she and Hinton had eventually ordered reflected both sources of knowledge. They had sown it in April rain, which was good. They had left it. May had brought the grass thickening, which was worrying if you did not know it was expected. The native species were establishing below the surface, building root systems in the newly improved soil, doing the invisible work that would not be visible until much later. The field, in May, looked like a field that had been seeded with nothing in particular. June brought the first flowers. Tiny, sparse, easy to miss, but Eleanor did not miss them. She walked the field in June with the particular attention she had learned from years in the kitchen garden, the way you look when you are looking for something specific among a great deal that is not the thing. She found bird's foot trefoil first, yellow and beginning to spread in a small patch near the center of the field, then meadow buttercup, then, at the edge near the stone wall, the beginning of common knapweed, which she had specifically included because it was excellent for the insects. Hinton, who was not a man given to emotional reactions to things, found Eleanor crouching in the June grass looking at the bird's foot trefoil and said, quietly, "There she is." Eleanor looked up at him. He was not talking about the flower. She did not correct him. July was the most beautiful month in the field. Not because the meadow was complete. It was nowhere near complete. This was the first year and full establishment would take 2 or 3 more. But because enough had come through that the sense of what it would be was visible. The way you can see the shape of a piece of music in its first movement, even though the other movements are still to come. By July, there was a yellow-green haze over the field on clear mornings that was the dew on the grass and the early flowers together, and if you stood at the stone wall and looked north across the field and then across the valley to the low line of woodland, it was already different from what it had been a year ago, when it was flat managed pasture without variation. It had texture now. It had life. Edmund came to the field in July, on a warm evening, and stood beside Eleanor at the wall and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "My father would not have believed this field could be this." Eleanor looked at him. "He managed the estate well," Edmund said, "in most ways, but he was practical without imagination. He would have looked at a field with poor drainage and seen only the drainage problem. He would not have seen what could be underneath it." Eleanor said, "Sometimes you cannot see what is underneath until you fix what is on top." He looked at her. She was looking at the field. "Yes," he said, "I have found that to be true." In late August, they prepared for the yellow rattle. Eleanor and Hinton worked out the sections where it should go first. The areas where the grass was thickest, where the competition would most need to be managed, where the yellow rattle's particular ability to weaken the grasses would do the most good. The yellow rattle was a hemiparasite, which meant it connected to the roots of nearby grasses and drew nutrients from them, gradually reducing their vigor and opening space for the less competitive wildflowers to establish. It was, Eleanor thought, a very specific kind of plant. It did its work invisibly, underground, and the results appeared in the season after. She liked this about it. She had written to Mrs. Fentham in July about the field, with a description of what was growing and where, and Mrs. Fentham had written back with great satisfaction and had mentioned that her own poppies had been extraordinary this year, the best in 5 years, and that she had managed to get them established in a second bed that had previously been too compacted, using the builder's grit approach. Eleanor had written back, "It is gratifying when the advice works." Mrs. Fentham had written, "Everything good requires time and correct preparation. The only surprise is that people continue to be surprised by this." Eleanor had laughed when she read this and put the letter in the drawer where she kept the things worth keeping. Now, in early September, the morning light lower and the swallows already leaving, she and Hinton stood at the edge of the field with the yellow rattle seeds. The packet from Edmund's original gift, the one sent at Christmas, for September, had long since been supplemented by a larger order from the same supplier, but she had set aside a portion of those original seeds, the ones he had sent her in December when everything was still only beginning, and she sowed those first, by hand, in the section of the field nearest the stone wall. She walked slowly, scattering the seeds with the particular even motion she had developed over years of sowing, her hand moving in a steady, practiced arc. The seeds were small and light, with their distinctive papery wing that helped them catch the wind, though there was not much wind today. They fell into the grass and disappeared. You could not see them. You could not see anything happening. But it was happening, and it would continue to happen through the winter. The seeds going through the cold that they needed to germinate, the ground holding them, the process running below everything that was visible. And in the spring, if the conditions were right and the ground was what she had made it and the seeds were viable and the timing was correct, there would be small green seedlings among the grass, and by summer the yellow rattle would be in flower and the field would be taking another step toward what it was becoming. Edmund came to the field at noon. He came through the gate in the stone wall carrying 2 cups from the kitchen. Mrs. Greer had apparently decided this was a reasonable thing to do, and he walked across the field to where Eleanor and Hinton were finishing the last section. He gave Eleanor a cup and looked at the field. "It is beginning," he said. "It began last year," Eleanor said. "This is the continuation of the beginning." He smiled. Hinton accepted the second cup with the nod of a man who is very glad for the tea and who is also privately pleased at how the morning has gone, and he walked back toward the gate to give them a moment, which was thoughtful of him. Eleanor stood in the September field and looked across it at the low autumn sun, the light warm and flat, the field full of its invisible work, the seeds already in the ground where they could not be seen. Edmund stood beside her. They were quiet for a while. He said, eventually, "What do you think it will look like in 3 years?" Eleanor thought about this with the honest care she brought to questions worth answering. She said, "Messier than a formal garden, more alive than a managed pasture. In late spring it will be green and yellow from the rattle and the buttercup and the trefoil. In summer it will be this." She gestured across the field at what was already there. "But more so, denser, the colors of it changing week by week, which is different from a formal bed that holds the same color all season. And the ox-eye daisies," she paused, "they will come back." "You think so?" "The seed bank is not entirely gone," she said. "The conditions have been poor for 20 years, which is why you haven't seen them. But ox-eye daisies are extraordinarily persistent. If we give them the right conditions for 2 or 3 seasons, the ones that are still in the soil will respond." She looked at the field. "I cannot promise it, but I think it is very likely." He was looking at her with the expression she knew best by now, the one he had on when he was actually listening, when the information he was receiving was going somewhere real inside him rather than being held at the surface. He said, "What was the thing Agnes Fentham said to you, in the letter?" Eleanor thought back. She said that most things worth growing take 3 years. He was quiet. "She was right about that," he said. "She usually is," Eleanor said. "About most things." The September air moved across the field, and the grass moved with it, and the small seeds that had been scattered that morning moved invisibly with the grass, already beginning their work. Somewhere in the thicket of native grass near the center of the field, a grasshopper was singing. Still, this late in the season, still here. Eleanor raised her cup and drank her tea. She looked at the field and thought about 3 years from now, the ox-eye daisies, the yellow rattle, the full complexity of an established meadow that had taken 10 years of work and patience and failure and learning to arrive at. She thought about the letter she had read 5 years ago in a kitchen in Hartwell Manor, in a book that was sold at a church fete in 1902, and which she had bought for a penny because the title interested her, which said that all good things have a biography. She had thought about that sentence, off and on, for 5 years. She understood it now more than she had then. Not just about food, as the writer had meant, about fields and seeds and households and people, and the long, invisible work of becoming something that is worth being. You cannot begin in the middle. You cannot arrive at the good thing without the seasons that come before it, the preparation and the failure and the learning and the patience. You cannot skip the year the plants barely survived. You cannot skip the year they were indifferent. You have to go through both before you arrive at the year you have more than you know what to do with. She had gone through them. She was standing in her September field, with her husband beside her, and her seeds in the ground, and the grasshopper still singing, and the swallows preparing to leave, and she was standing precisely where everything she had ever been through had brought her, and none of it had been wasted, and none of it had been wrong, and even the worn blue dress had been right, in the end, because it had been entirely honest. She was honest. She had always been honest. That, in the end, was what the story was. Not the dress, not the ball, not the title or the estate or the announcement in the county newspaper or any of the things that the county remembered when they told the story later, which they would, and which would become, over time, a story about a duke and a young woman in a ball gown and a dance and a happy ending, because that was the shape that made sense from the outside. But from the inside, from her own point of view, standing in the September field in the 10th year of the new century, with the light falling low and warm across the grass, the story was about what happens when you are completely, simply, without apology yourself, and the right person sees it. It was about Agnes Fentham, who had been paying attention. It was about yellow rattle seeds, sent for September, in a letter from a man she was coming to love. It was about clay soil and patience, and the slow, invisible work of growing things that are worth growing. It was about that. Edmund said quietly, "What are you thinking?" She turned to look at him. She said, "I am thinking that I should have more faith in autumn." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the field was all around them in the September light, and it was working, and it would keep working, and they were both, in their different ways, exactly where they needed to be. Hinton returned from the gate with the empty cup and an assessment he had been preparing since morning. He said, "The northeast corner is as good as I have seen it in 30 years. The drainage is holding." Eleanor said, "Good." He said, "I think we will see a very different field by spring." Eleanor said, "I think we will." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his work with the particular energy of a man who has invested himself in a project and is seeing the investment begin to return something. Edmund watched him go. He said, "You have managed to make him care about a field he had given up on." "He cared about it already," Eleanor said. "He just needed someone to care in the same direction at the same time." Edmund looked at her. She turned back to the field and finished her tea. The afternoon came in slowly, the way September afternoons do, the light shifting from the sharp clarity of morning to something more golden and less direct, the shadows lengthening across the grass, the grasshopper eventually going quiet. The temperature dropped, degrees at a time, as the sun moved lower, and the field took on the particular stillness of late afternoon in a season that is turning. They walked the perimeter together, the full boundary, which Eleanor did regularly, and which she had come to think of as a form of listening to the field. Different things were visible from different vantage points, and walking all the way around gave you a complete picture that any single position could not provide. At the northeast corner, where the drainage had been repaired, Eleanor crouched down and pressed her hand to the earth. The soil was different here now from what it had been that first frozen December, when she had pressed her gloved hand to the ground and felt the compaction. The texture had changed, not transformed, not unrecognizable, but improved. The work was there in the feel of it below the surface. She straightened. Edmund was watching. "Still improving," she said. "How long does soil take to fully recover?" he asked. "Longer than a person," she said. "Decades sometimes. But the improvement is measurable long before it is complete. You can see it working." She brushed the soil from her hand and they moved on. They finished the walk at the south wall, the familiar position, the view between the oaks that she had stood in last December with the ground frozen and the sky bright and the whole thing barely begun. She stood in the same place now, in September, with the field behind her established and alive and working, and she looked at the same view. The valley, the distant woodland, the late sun on everything. It was not the same view. Same direction, same elements, same valley and the same stand of oaks through which you looked. But the light was different and the season was different and the person looking had been changed, not dramatically, but the way things are changed by a year of living. Which is to say, in the accumulation of small things, each barely noticeable, that become, together, a substantial difference. She was a different person from who had stood here in December. She was more herself. Edmund came and stood beside her, as he had before, and they looked at the view together. And neither of them said anything for a while, which was one of the things she had come to love about being with him, that he understood the uses of silence, that he did not feel the need to fill it, that he was genuinely comfortable simply being in a place with her. "Tell me something," he said after a while. "What?" "Anything," he said. "Tell me something you have been thinking about." Eleanor looked at the view. She said, "I have been thinking about the kitchen at Hartwell Manor. Mrs. Briggs is not young, she will retire eventually, and I think the household will manage better with 2 younger people than one very good person who is too tired to manage it well. My mother should begin to plan for that." He was quiet. "That is what you have been thinking about," he said. "Among other things." He smiled. She said, "What were you expecting?" "Something more lyrical," he said, "given the field, and the September, and the general atmosphere." "Mrs. Briggs's retirement planning is important," Eleanor said, with perfect seriousness. He laughed, the real laugh, the one that came before he could adjust it. She turned and looked at him, and she let herself enjoy the fact of him. The laugh, the face, the steady, reliable presence of a person she had now known for almost a year. Through the November ball and the December letters and the January question in the winter garden, and the February ring and the April wedding and the long summer of building and growing and tending, and who was exactly what she had assessed him to be in the first dance of the first waltz, and exactly what she had told herself not to construct before she was sure, and who had been there all along, steady and patient, until she was ready to see clearly what had always been there. She said, "I am going to write to Mrs. Fentham this week. About the field, about the yellow rattle, about September." She paused. "And to tell her that the ox-eye daisies are coming back. You cannot know that yet." "No," she said, "but I am confident." He looked at her. "Then I am confident too," he said. They walked back through the gate, leaving the field to its quiet September work, the seeds in the ground, the roots in the clay, the invisible processes of growth that required nothing from anyone now but time and decent conditions, and the turning of the seasons. In the morning she would look at the kitchen records and the staff accounts and the plans she and Mrs. Greer had been developing for the winter provisions, and she would visit the walled garden to check the progress of the espalier pears she had been training against the south wall since spring. In a few weeks she would write to Constance, who had been sending letters from Bath and then from Bristol, where she had gone for a week to see William Keating, and who was beginning to sound, in each subsequent letter, more settled in herself, more at ease, less like a person managing a performance and more like a person simply living. In winter she would bring in the vegetable crop from the Cavendish kitchen garden, the one she had rebuilt from the southwest beds in February, and see what the first year had produced and what it told her about the second. In spring, God willing, she would see the yellow rattle germinate. And in summer, if everything went as she believed it would, the field would be something to stand in. But all of that was ahead, and the September afternoon was here, and the light was warm and low on everything, and the field was doing its work. And Eleanor came back through the gate with her husband, and pulled it closed behind her, and felt the latch settle into place with the small, complete sound of something that has found its fit. She had written once, in January, in the journal she kept for thoughts worth examining, "I do not wish to be small anymore." She had not been small. She had been exactly herself, in the worn blue dress, in the winter garden, in the frozen field in December, in the sitting room on every Tuesday, exactly and completely herself. And it had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been, it turned out, precisely what was needed. She crossed the grass toward the house, and the house was warm and lit ahead of her, and the kitchen smelled of the evening meal being prepared. And somewhere inside, Mrs. Greer was finishing the household accounts with the steady satisfaction of a woman who finds those accounts very much in order. And the library was at the south end of the house with its 2 chairs by the window and its shelves of well-read books. She went inside. She hung her coat. She washed the garden from her hands. and she carried the September afternoon into the warm rooms of her house, and she felt it settle around her, and she was home.